1989, when Karl Tanzler was just 12 years old and living with his family in Dresden, Germany, he had a very strange dream. In this dream, he found himself in this black void where everywhere he looked, it was just nothingness. And then behind him, he heard footsteps. And so he whips himself around and he looks, and there's this woman dressed in this big, puffy, elegant white dress walking towards him out of the darkness. And when she walks right up in front of him, she comes to a stop, and she introduces herself as Anna Constantia von Brockdorf, who was a real person in the early 1700s. She was a noblewoman in Germany, and she would tell Karl that she is actually a distant relative of his, and that she was here to pass on a very important message. Karl was rooted to the spot. He didn't know if he should be afraid of what she was going to say, or excited, or nervous, but before he could decide, Anna had already turned and was pointing in the direction she had appeared out of. And so Karl turns and looks in the direction she was pointing, and out of this blackness, out of this void, came this woman's face. It was a face detached from a body. It almost looked like a floating picture of a woman's face. And as this face floated closer and closer to them, Karl was immediately struck by just how beautiful this woman was. Her hair was jet black like a raven's feathers, and her skin was white like porcelain. But there was something off about this woman, this floating face. She looked sad and kind of frail. And so as Karl found himself staring at this face, which was now right next to them, Anna spoke to him again, and she would tell Karl that this woman, the floating face, she's going to appear in your life later on, and it is your mission given by God to save her. She's going to be very ill, very sick, and you need to find a way to keep her alive. Then Karl, in real life, woke up, and immediately he was struck by just how visceral that dream had been. It really felt like that had just happened to him, but after a few moments, it seemed like, okay, that was just a dream. But unlike other visceral dreams he had had in the past, this one did not gradually fade from his memory. Instead, over the course of that day, the memory specifically of the raven-haired woman's face really seemed to become more clear and more concrete in his mind, to the point where at the end of that day, he could easily remember exactly what she looked like. Over the following days and months and years, Karl periodically would have this same dream, this same vision of his distant relative Anna, who would come out of the void, and she would remind him to be on the lookout for this raven-haired woman when God sent her to him. But despite these constant reminders in his dreams, and Karl being ever vigilant to look for this raven-haired woman in real life, he never actually found her. He never met this woman he was supposed to save. Fast forward to 1926. Karl was 39 years old. By this point, he had gotten married, not to the raven-haired woman, but instead to a local woman in Dresden. And the pair had had 2 daughters together, and they lived a simple life. And, by and large, Karl seemed rather content and happy with his life. However, secretly, he was a little disappointed that these dreams, these visions that he was having of Anna and the raven-haired woman, that they had not come true, that it really had just been a dream. That year, due to an economic downturn in Germany, Karl and his family left Germany and emigrated to the United States, where they believed there would be better opportunities for them. And when they arrived in the United States, they settled in Central Florida. But within a year, Karl and his wife had a severe falling out, and they split up. And so Karl would leave the family home in Central Florida, and he would resettle several hundred miles south in Southern Florida in a town called Key West. And it would be in Key West that Karl would get a job as an X-ray technician at a local hospital, and it would also be in Key West that Karl's life would change forever. Less than a year after settling in Key West, Karl was at the hospital going about his day when an older woman walked into the office, and she said to Karl that she was there to get her daughter, her 21-year-old daughter, an X-ray of her chest, because her daughter apparently couldn't stop coughing and they were concerned about it. And so Karl began doing the paperwork with the mother, when suddenly the daughter came into the office. And as soon as Karl saw her, he knew immediately that she was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. She walked in and she sat down in a chair, and Karl just stopped what he was doing and stared at the daughter. And then he kind of broke out of it and turned his attention back to the mother, and he said to her, "Ma'am, don't worry. I will do everything in my power to save your daughter's life." Now, the mother didn't know what was wrong with her daughter. And so this was both really helpful that this man she was talking to was so willing to help, and also kind of ominous that he was already insinuating that she could be dying. But either way, the mother said, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. And so Carl and the mother, they finished their paperwork, and then Carl quickly left from behind his desk and hustled over to the daughter, and he introduced himself, and he reiterated that she was in good hands. And the daughter was a little bit weirded out by this, but she was polite and said thank you, and she said her name was Elena. And so Carl would take Elena and bring her back and give her the x-ray, and unfortunately, he would discover through this x-ray that she had tuberculosis. Today, that disease is easily curable, but at the time, that was a death sentence. When Carl saw this, though, in a weird way, it almost made him happy, because this was another indication that, this really was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. Not only did she look the part, but she also had arrived in desperate need of help. And so now Carl needed to find a way to save her, even though he was just an x-ray technician. He was not a doctor, and so he had no clue how to begin to treat tuberculosis. But that didn't stop Carl. Over the next year, Carl would be in touch with Elena and her family on a near daily basis, updating them on all of the new techniques to fight tuberculosis that he was doing all this research on, and he would tell them about experimental procedures and drugs they could try, even sometimes paying out of pocket for them to go try them. He would also bring Elena into the office as often as he possibly could to x-ray her again and again and again to see if perhaps she was making good progress. But unfortunately, over the course of that year where he was doing everything he could, it just didn't work. The disease ravaged Elena's body, and on October 31st, 1931, so roughly a year after Carl had first met Elena would unfortunately pass away. Elena's family was devastated by this, but their grief didn't even compare to Carl's grief. It was like Carl had lost his life too. He couldn't believe he had failed his mission and let the raven-haired woman die. When it came time to bury Elena, Carl said, "Let me pay for the most elaborate gravesite we can possibly make. Let me set up a mausoleum for her." A mausoleum is an external building that sits in a cemetery that effectively serves as a kind of shrine to the deceased. And so her family, they understood that Carl had become very, very close with Elena, although they didn't fully understand the relationship, but they did understand she meant a lot to him, and so they agreed to let him do this. After Elena was buried inside of this small temple that Carl had built for her, Carl began spending virtually all of his time kneeling inside of it, crying and begging for Elena's forgiveness. Elena's family was well aware that Carl was doing this, and at first they kind of just let it happen, but after several months, they began to tell Carl, you really need to let her go. You need to begin to move on. But Carl refused. In fact, over time, he only became more and more obsessed with Elena. Finally, after 7 years of Carl doing this, Elena's family decided, enough is enough. He really needs to stop making her loss all about him. It's not his loss, it's our loss. We're her family. And so the family decided the only way to kind of get Carl to stop doing what he was doing is to demand he give the key back that gave him access into the small area inside of the mausoleum. So one night, Elena's sister, whose name was Florinda, decided to go over to Carl's house unannounced and confront him and get the key back from him. And so she hopped in her car and she drove over to his property. His house was kind of set back off the road behind some trees, and so you had to drive down this kind of winding driveway to get to it. And so Florinda turned onto his driveway and she began driving, and when his house came into view, the first thing she noticed was a number of the windows on the first floor were all lit up. Clearly, Carl was home, and as she's driving towards the house, she's just looking in these windows, and for a second, she sees Carl, and he's very elegantly dressed in a suit or a tuxedo, and he's ballroom dancing with this woman who's also very elegantly dressed as well. And for a second, Florinda considered turning around and not disturbing him, but then she thought, you know what, this has been going on for so long, I just need to get this over with. And so she drove her car and stopped in front of Carl's house. She hopped out, she walked up onto his porch, and she knocked on his front door. Inside, she could hear music was clearly playing, but just a few seconds after she had knocked, the music was cut off, and then no one came to the door. And so Florinda knows there's people inside this house, and so she knocks again, but again, there's no movement in the house. It's just silent, as if the people inside are pretending not to be there. And so finally, frustrated, Florinda knocks on the door a third time and says, "Carl, I know you're in there. I have to talk to you about my sister. Please come out here." And so finally, she heard the shuffling of feet, and then she heard the sound of the door unlocking, and it opened opened up just a crack. And through this crack, Carl looked through, and he looked out at Florinda very suspiciously, and he said to her, "What do you want?" And Florinda would say, "Look, I'm here to talk to you about my sister. Can I please come inside for a second? Or can you come out here and talk to me?" But Carl pretty much immediately said no, and then he shut the door. However, before he shut the door, Carl had very briefly stepped out of the way, allowing Florinda to see through that gap into the house. So before the door actually shut, she got to see who and what was inside that house. And what she saw was the woman Carl had been dancing with, and the woman was seated in a chair maybe halfway through the house, and she was facing the door. And Florinda knew immediately it was her sister. And so she's standing on the porch having no idea what to make of what she's just discovered. And so feeling kind of overwhelmed, she just kind of staggered off the front porch. She turned around, she ran into her car, and she drove off to tell the police. When the police came back, they knocked on the front door and they demanded that Carl let them see the woman he was there with. And so at this point, Carl knew the gig was up, and so he opened the door and he allowed them to come inside. And when the police went inside, they saw the woman he was with, and sure enough, it was Elena. However, Elena was deceased and had been for 7 years. After her death, Carl said he was able to talk to her inside of her mausoleum. And so that was why he was going back there every single night, because he and Elena were spending time together. And then at some point in 1933, so 2 years after Elena has been dead and buried, Carl would say she told him while he was visiting her mausoleum that she didn't like being in the mausoleum and that she wanted to come back with him and stay at his house. And so the following day, Carl had shown up with a child's wagon, and he pulled her out of her coffin, pulled her out of the mausoleum, put her corpse in this wagon, and wheeled her back to his house. He had continued to go to the mausoleum every night for the next 5 years just to keep up appearances, but Elena's body never went back inside of it. She would stay at his house, where he painstakingly attempted to restore Elena's very badly decomposed body to its original form. He strung piano wire through her entire body, connecting all of her bones together to keep her skeleton intact. He replaced her eyes with glass eyes, and he began rubbing the special wax all over her skin. He also stuffed her insides full of rags in order to give her a full, natural look, and he constantly sprayed her with perfume to reduce the smell. Once she was, in his eyes, back to normal, he began spending as much time with her as he possibly could. He would change her outfits constantly, he would put on makeup, and he would give her new jewelry, and he would talk to her about the ups and downs of life. He would laugh with her, he would cry with her, he would sleep with her. Carl would admit that ultimately his goal with keeping Elena in his home was to eventually still save her life. He believed if he could somehow get her body up into the stratosphere, that the radiation up there would bring her back to life. And if he could do that, he would be fulfilling his God-given mission to protect her. But Carl never got a chance to launch her into the stratosphere. Instead, he was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. However, these charges would be dropped and Carl would be set free. As for Elena, her body was returned to her family and they would bury her in Key West. Longtime therapist, a 70-year-old man named Art, began writing about what happened to him and his family 30 years earlier in 1989. His therapist only knew Art had lost a child and felt very guilty about it, but the conditions under which the child was lost was always very gray. Even though Art had been his patient for years and the therapist had repeatedly tried to get more information. Was this a child that was lost in pregnancy? Was it a child that was born and died or ran away? Those details never emerged, and every time the therapist tried to dig in, Art would back off, close up, and he would not talk about it. And so finally, his therapist said, "Art, you just need to find a way to talk about this stuff. If you're not going to talk about it with me, then perhaps you should write it all down in a private journal. It'll be a very cathartic experience, and it might help you get over that guilt you're feeling." So Art reluctantly agrees. He goes home, he gets out a piece of paper, and he begins writing all the details of everything that happened leading up to that day in 1989 and what actually happened on that day in 1989. And when he was done and he had a chance to look at what he had written, he didn't feel better. He felt worse. He felt more guilty. But that's because Art had a secret that the therapist didn't know about. And now that it was out on paper, Art suddenly felt like, you know what, before I die, I have to tell the world what me and my wife did. So in 2019, he took all of those notes that he had written down about what had happened and he posted it to Reddit. This is his confession story. Art's son was very, very troubled. Art would say, if you've seen the movie, We Need to Talk About Kevin, where a couple's son turns out to be a total psychopath, Art says that's a pretty good representation of what home life was like with our son. From the day Art's son was born in 1971, it was like something was off about him. Art and his wife Lisa had planned this pregnancy, and they were ecstatic when their baby boy was welcomed to the world, and they showered him with affection and love and did everything they possibly could to give him a warm, loving environment. But no matter what they did, it just seemed like he was always miserable. Their son cried constantly for the first 13 months of his life. Now, Art and Lisa understood that when you bring a baby home, there's a good chance they're going to cry. But his crying was so constant, and he could not be calmed down, that they grew concerned that this was more than just a colicky baby, that there could be some underlying issue. And so they brought their son to doctors and specialists, and they tried every treatment under the sun. They changed his diet, they changed his room, they sang him songs, they changed everything they could, but it never stopped. And so 13 months of grinding, grating, no sleep time. Finally, in the 14th month of his life, he seemed to get over the incessant crying stage, and Art and Lisa were so relieved. It seemed like finally they could just be loving parents and not be so frustrated with their child all the time. But it seemed like now that he wasn't crying, he still was just totally unhappy. His body language and everything about him said, "I'm not happy." Always. Art said that he never saw his son ever have a genuine, joyous smile. The only time he saw something resembling a smile was when his son would grin after causing someone pain or breaking a rule or in some way being bad. And then once his son started walking, all he wanted to do was just destroy everything in front of him. But again, Art and Lisa, they realized that this is all pretty typical child behavior, albeit maybe on the more extreme end of bad behavior, but it's still in the realm of normal child. And they're thinking that they are the reason this is happening. And so they're not blaming their son at this point. They're still doing everything they can to take care of him and love him to the best of their ability. When their son was about 2 years old, he learned how to take off his diaper, and he began sneaking around the house and emptying the contents of his diaper into corners of the house, underneath carpets, grinding it into the carpet, smearing it on the walls. But again, Art and Lisa are looking inward and saying, our child is only 2 years old. It can't be his fault he's acting this way. It's our fault for not finding a way to correct this behavior. But Art and Lisa started to drift away from that opinion when their son got a little bit older, got potty trained, and wasn't using diapers anymore, and still was going around the house and squatting down and going to the bathroom all over the house, making a mess at every possible chance he could. And not just when he was 4, 5, 6 years old. All the way up until he was 15 years old, he was doing this. And he stopped doing it in random corners, and he began only going into his parents' bedroom every chance he got, opening up the sheets, going inside, going to the bathroom, shutting it back up, and leaving. It got to the point where Art and Lisa literally could not stop their son from doing this. He was absolutely determined to do this. So anytime they were away, he would even sneak in the windows to do this. I mean, he was totally hell-bent on going to the bathroom in their bed. And so they had to start putting locks on the windows and the doors of their bedroom. But when they had finally secured that room to where he really couldn't get in anymore, he began going to the bathroom right outside their door and in the other beds in the house. And so they began investing in locks on all of the doors. They even replaced the doors themselves because they were too flimsy, and they thought there's a good chance he might kick these doors in to try to get them open. So they put these big, thick doors up all through their house and put these big locks with key locks all over the house to keep their son from going in and going to the bathroom all over their bed sheets. As their son grew older, he became more and more unmanageable, well beyond just going to the bathroom in different places. He became violent, and he would bite and kick and scratch and spit on anybody that came near him. He was like a wild animal. Before he was 9 years old, he had been kicked out of school 2 separate times. When they let him back in a 3rd time, he apparently did something that was so bad that they effectively expelled him. A 9-year-old is getting expelled from school. So they had to enroll him at this other special school that would accept him with his history, But part of the deal with this school is you don't have any interaction with other students. He was considered too dangerous to be around other kids. So he was totally isolated at school, and it ultimately made him a lot worse. Once he was enrolled in this school, he became really violent at home. He would come home from school and he would go right to the kitchen and get a knife out, and he would start threatening his parents, to the point where they had to lock all the drawers in the kitchen. Once all of the knives were under lock and key in Art's house, his son began stealing knives from the neighbor's house, smuggling them back into the house, and at night he would pull them out and try to stab Art. And on 2 different occasions he was successful, and Art still has scars on his leg from it. And Art's son was not just attacking his parents. He was also turning on local animals that were helpless. He blinded one of the local dogs that was running around the area by just stabbing it in the eye one day. He went after one of the stray cats and he lit its tail on fire. And honestly, Art doesn't even know the other damages he had done to other animals or even other people. Even though Art and Lisa massively resented their son for how badly he treated them and how difficult he was making their lives, they recognized that this was a child that needed help. And so they tried everything they could to help him by enrolling him in that special school that ultimately was isolating, but it was an attempt to try to help him, or bringing him to different therapists and psychologists and doctors, putting him on different medications and bringing him to meditation consultants. I mean, you name it, they tried everything they could to try to help this kid, but nothing worked. He only got angrier and got bigger and stronger and more aggressive and violent. And eventually Art and Lisa are like, what do we do about this? What ultimately started happening over the following years is Art and Lisa became prisoners of their own home, that every time their son was around, they felt unsafe around him. He was such a wild card and he had these crazy angry outbursts, and he was clearly prone to extreme violence. And so they began using those heavy doors and locks to lock themselves away from their son. It was the only way they felt safe. And so with that in mind, fast forward to 1988, when Art's son is now 16 years old, and Art and Lisa find out they're pregnant again. It was a surprise, and they were not happy about it. In fact, because of how badly it had gone with their son, they were really scared that another child was going to be just as bad, and they couldn't possibly go through this again. And so they decided that they weren't going to terminate, but if they noticed early on this child was a huge problem child, as horrible as they felt about it, they knew they would give it up for adoption. They simply couldn't do this again. This time they had a daughter, and she was normal. She was nothing like their son. She didn't come home and cry constantly. She smiled and laughed, and after a few months she was sleeping through the night, and she was hitting her milestones, and she just seemed happy, and she was easy. And it was around this time that Art and Lisa began to realize just how bad their son was. Seeing how wonderful their daughter was just amplified all of their son's atrocious behavior over the first 16 years of his life. And so Art and Lisa really began to look at their son as more of a lost cause. And they were less invested in going through the motions to try to find some way to help him when they knew it wasn't going to work. It had never worked. And he's only a couple years away from being 18, and he can go out on his own and figure it out for himself. And now, since they didn't really care as much about him, suddenly his behavior was intolerable. And anytime he acted up, they would never lay a hand on him, but they were not afraid to tell him to basically get the F out of here. We are not putting up with this. Leave. And so regularly, Art and Lisa would have these horrific screaming matches with their son until their son would basically run away in a rage and then come back hours later or even a couple days later. And Art said he began to look forward to fighting with his son because every time they fought, it meant his son would be gone for a little while afterwards, and there would be a little bit of peace and calm inside the house. But at the same time, Art and Lisa were concerned one of these days he's going to come back in after one of these fights and he's going to kill us. So it went on like this for about a year until a rainy day in 1989 when their son was almost 18 and their daughter was almost 1 year old. Now, the house they lived in was a single-story bungalow, and their daughter's room was against a sidewall where there was a window leading to the outside. That morning, Art and Lisa had got into one of the worst screaming matches with their son they had ever had, and he left in a rage, and they slammed and locked the door behind him. After a couple of hours, their son is still gone, and they don't expect to see him anytime soon, and their daughter is starting to get fussy. She seems tired, and so they walk into her bedroom, they put her in her crib for a nap, and then Art and Lisa leave her room, shut the door behind them, and go sit down in the kitchen. A couple minutes later, they hear their daughter screaming at the top of her lungs, and Art and Lisa immediately recognize this is not an ordinary cry. This sounds like something is terribly wrong. They get up and sprint down the hallway into a room and they try the door handle, but it's locked. They run back out to the kitchen, they get the keys, they go back, they're fumbling with the keys, they finally open it up, and there in the back of the room, standing next to the crib, is their son. And he's holding a knife and he's poking it into her face. And Art said he looked at his daughter and he could see blood on her stomach and blood on her arm, and she's screaming. And so he thinks to himself, thank God she's still alive. And instinctively, Art starts running to try to put himself between his son and his daughter. But before he could even get there, his wife had moved much faster and she charged over and smashes her son's hand. The knife falls to the ground. She pushes him as hard as she possibly can, and he goes slamming into the wall and falls on the ground. Art immediately reaches into the crib, picks his daughter up, and runs to the other side of the room. And he kind of looks her over. She's crying, she's in pain, she's scared, but he can see the cuts on her are superficial. He turns back around and he can see his wife is standing there with her fist balled, standing in front of her son. Her son stands up and he's looking at her, no emotion on his face. Art would even say that it was like he was looking at an alien. This person wasn't human. How could they do this to their own sister, to a baby? And he stared at him, and then he noticed his wife was moving towards her son like she was going to attack him. And this is where Art says he knew he was supposed to go over there and stop whatever was about to happen. But he didn't. And this is the part of the story where Art reveals his wife, she's this amazing boxer, and he knew that she could beat the living crap out of just about anybody. The son is so stunned by how quickly this has happened that he's not doing anything. He's not positioning himself to fight back or to even preemptively attack his mother. He's just kind of standing there looking at his mother with no expression on his face. And that's when Art's wife winds up and blasts him across the face, knocking his head back. And Art said immediately he could tell his nose was broken, blood squirts all over his face, and he falls to the ground. Until this moment, neither Lisa nor Art had ever laid a hand on their son. Even when he stabbed Art twice in the legs, they never physically struck their son. But this was different. Their son had crossed the line and he could never come back. And so even though Art knew if he doesn't step in, his wife is going to beat their son to death, even though he knew that was going to happen, he remembers thinking, good. He turns around and he leaves the room with his daughter. As Art cleans up his daughter and puts band-aids on each of the cuts that were inflicted on her, he hears in the other room his son is yelling and screaming at their mother, saying, I'm going to kill you. And she is just ruthlessly punching, kicking, and smashing him. It is not slowing down at all. And Art remembers by the time he picked his daughter back up, after putting all her band-aids on and she'd kind of calmed down, he still heard his wife punching, kicking, and smashing their son, who's now unconscious. Again, Art knows if I don't go in there now, my unconscious son is getting his head kicked in by his mother. If I don't go in there now, he's gonna die, for sure. But Art wants that to happen, so he doesn't go in there. Instead, he just rocks his daughter until she falls asleep, and by the time she's snoring in his arms, his wife is still punching, kicking, and smashing their son, who hasn't made a sound in a long time. Art just sits down at the kitchen table, hoists his daughter onto his shoulder, and just listens for his wife to finish what she's doing. And finally it does go quiet in there, and his wife emerges from the room, and she's covered in blood. Her hands are swollen and red, and her chest is heaving like she's been running a race. She comes into the kitchen and sits down at the table next to Art and looks at him, and he looks back at her, and he just says, is he dead? And she says, I hope so. And he just goes, yeah, me too. Art and Lisa sat at the kitchen table for a long time. There was no sound coming from the room where their son was. And eventually Lisa starts crying and goes and takes a shower. At which point Art stands up and he goes into the bedroom where his son was. And this is when he can tell his son is actually still alive. He walks in and he can see his son still breathing, but he's covered in blood. He's got vomit on him. He's clearly wet his pants. His teeth have been knocked out. His whole face is bloodied and bruised and swollen. And he goes up to him and he thinks there's no way he's going to live through this. But Art has kind of an internal crisis because he wants him to die. He doesn't want him to live. And so that decision of should I call an ambulance or should I call police was a really difficult one to make because really neither served the purpose that he or his wife wanted. And so as he's standing there wondering what to do, he hears his wife come out of the shower. And so he leaves the room and he confers with his wife and they decide, we're not going to call the police. We're not going to call an ambulance. We're going to do nothing. And so right then and there, they walked around their house, they gathered up a couple things, and they headed downstairs into the basement where they had an in-law suite, which basically was a little apartment that they didn't really use, but it had everything they needed. And they moved down there and they locked the one door that led down there and they locked the side door as well. They figured if he lived, there would be enough food to get him through a few weeks upstairs. There's water up there, bedrooms, bathrooms. He had all of that. And at some point he would run out of food and he would have to leave. Or he would die upstairs, and in a couple weeks they would go up and they would deal with it. Over the next week, they began to hear movement upstairs, which signaled to them he was alive, but he wasn't moving around much. It was just enough to know somebody was up there. They figured that, okay, he's probably laying down most of the time recovering. And so Art began going back to work. He would go out the side door, and every time he went outside and he was on the driveway, he was expecting his son to come out and attack him, but he never did. And his wife, Lisa, she stayed with their daughter 24/7, stayed in the house, and at no point did the son ever try to come downstairs and try to attack her or them at any point. Probably because he was afraid of his mother. About 3 weeks after the attack, they were in bed in the basement and they heard him going absolutely ballistic upstairs, screaming, punching walls, breaking things. And they decided, you know what, whatever he does up there, it's not worth going up there and confronting him. Let him do whatever he wants. And then the next day, it was totally quiet. And for the next couple of days, Art and Lisa would listen really intently to see if they could hear him moving around upstairs, but they couldn't. And so finally, Art and Lisa decide to go up into the main floor and see if he's up there. When they open the door, they find their entire upstairs has been absolutely wrecked. Every piece of furniture is ruined, every window's broken, there's glass all over the place, there's brown smears all over the walls. But their son isn't there. And so they figured that night when they heard him going crazy upstairs, he already knew he was going to leave. He just wanted to ruin their house before he did. Even though their son was gone, they had no idea if he was going to come back or not. And so for days and weeks and months, they lived in fear that their son was just going to show up one day and kill them. But he never did. And then 3 years after the incident, they moved and they weren't in contact with their son. They hadn't seen him. And so he had no idea where they were going and they have no way to contact him. So that was it. They just restarted somewhere else. Fast forward to 2019 when Art is making this Reddit post and he says, I haven't seen my son since 1989 and I don't want to see him again. And Art goes on to say that while he hopes his son was able to overcome his demons and live a normal life, he said if he wasn't able to do that, if he was out there still causing pain and misery to other people, Art says he hopes that whoever was on the receiving end of that finished the job. 2nd, 1848, a German doctor named Karl Heinrich August von Bulow was just opening up his private medical practice in East Prussia when a teenage boy burst in through the doors looking totally frantic. Before the doctor could ask any questions, the teenager blurted out that another boy in town needed his help right now. When the doctor asked, what does the boy need? The teenager would say, well, the boy is honking like a goose. For a second, Dr. von Bulow thought this might be a joke, but then he saw the look on the teenager's face and he could tell he was very upset and very serious. So the doctor grabbed his bag and he ran outside with the teenager and they hailed a horse and carriage and they told the driver to hurry up. When Dr. von Bulow and this teenager arrived at the honking boy's house, the honking boy's mother came running outside looking totally flustered, and she flagged down the doctor and then brought him inside her house. And as she led the doctor through the home towards her son's bedroom, she explained what was going on. She said her 12-year-old son had been outside playing with his friends when suddenly he had developed this really intense coughing fit, kind of out of nowhere. And then finally, when the coughing stopped and the boy tried to breathe in, his throat made this horrible honking sound. And so her boy had come in the house honking with every breath, and so kind of in a panic, the mother had opened up her son's mouth and looked inside, but she hadn't seen anything, and she knew her son was not sick. There were no other symptoms really at all that were concerning about her son. It was just that he was honking. Now, for a while, the mother thought this would just kind of clear up, that maybe it was just kind of some byproduct of coughing really, really hard. But now it had been 18 hours and the boy was still honking with nearly every breath, which is why she had finally told the teen to go get the doctor. When the mother let Dr. von Bulow into her son's bedroom and he got a look at the honking boy, he couldn't believe how terrible the boy looked. His face was all swollen and kind of bluish, and he was sweating profusely, and when the doctor watched him try to breathe in, not only did he honk, but also very clearly this boy was really struggling just to breathe. So it was more than the sound, it looked like he was suffocating. And so the doctor rushed over to the boy and told him to open up his mouth. The boy did, and the doctor looked into his mouth, but there was nothing he could see that was blocking his airway. And so the doctor just put his finger into this boy's mouth, and he reached down inside, and suddenly he felt something lodged in the boy's throat that was small and hard, and he couldn't quite grab it. So he grabbed his forceps, which are kind of like big tweezers, and he reached back into the boy's mouth, and he tried to grab this object that was clearly obstructing his throat, but the object was too slippery and the doctor could not pull it out. And so the doctor is looking at this boy who's obviously struggling to breathe, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't get in there and get this obstruction out, this kid is going to die. And so the doctor made a decision right then and there to perform an emergency tracheotomy, which is a surgery where you basically cut a hole in someone's neck in order to create a hole in their throat to let air go in. But in this case, the doctor was just opening up his throat to try to get to this object. And so the doctor pulled out his scalpel and he performed the tracheotomy on this boy. He opened up his throat, and when he looked inside the hole into this boy's throat, he saw the obstruction. It was like this pink, small, hard object. And so the doctor just reached in, scooped it with his finger, and pulled it out. And right away, the boy could breathe again. He was not honking anymore. It was obvious that this fixed the problem, but the doctor and the mother are just looking at this object in the doctor's hand, having no idea how to react to this because it made no sense. The object that was trapped in this boy's throat that was making him honk like a goose was a literal goose's larynx. The larynx is a hollow tube in your throat that helps you make sound. In humans, we call it the voice box. And right before this boy began honking, he was playing a game with his friends that involved taking recently severed goosenecks and blowing through them like they were trumpets. And at some point, as this boy was doing it, he began to cough for some reason. And on the inhale, during one of these coughing fits, he had this gooseneck in front of his mouth. And so when he inhaled suddenly, he inhaled the goose larynx. And so that was why he sounded like a goose. He literally had a goose's voice box in his throat. Luckily, the honking boy would make a full recovery. 5:30 p.m. on November 21st, 2016, Jody Santoro, who was a 21-year-old mother in Melbourne, Australia, woke up to the sound of her 4-month-old son crying. Outside, there was this horrible thunderstorm going on. All this rain and hail were pelting the roof, and the wind was so strong that all the windows in the house were rattling. Jody reached over and grabbed her phone on the nightstand and checked the time, and she saw right away that she had overslept. However, it had been a really hot day that day, and she was so drained from the heat and also taking care of a 4-month-old that she wasn't really surprised she had overslept. But as the sound of her son's cries intensified, Jody knew, no matter how tired she was, she needed to get up and go tend to him. But the instant her legs swung off the bed and she actually tried to stand up, she knew something was wrong, and it had nothing to do with being tired. She had this incredible sense of dizziness come over her, and then her chest suddenly tightened up to the point where she could barely even breathe in. She found herself grabbing the bed just to steady herself. However, as alarming as this was, Jody didn't panic. She knew this feeling. She had been dealing with asthma for years, and she knew this was the start of an asthma attack. And so Jody reached over for her inhaler on the nightstand. She picked it up, brought it to her lips, pressed it down, and then took in a measured breath of the medication, expecting to pretty much immediately feel relief. But she didn't. The inhaler wasn't working. Jody again pressed down the inhaler harder this time and took a bigger breath in, hoping that a bit more medication might do the trick. But again, it just was not working. And so now with panic rising inside of her, she's, still struggling to breathe. Her son is still freaking out and she can't tend to him. And all she was thinking is, I have to get my nebulizer, which is basically a more robust version of an inhaler. It provides more medication more quickly into your body. However, the nebulizer, which was just over in her closet, required some setup. And she knew she felt so frantic right now and she was shaking so much that she didn't think she'd be able to set it up or even set it up in time before she passed out. Just then, her fiance walked into the bedroom, drawn there by the sound of their son crying. But the second he walked in, his attention was not on their son, it was instead on Jody, who by now was clutching the bed and kind of hobbled over and very clearly having some sort of medical emergency. Jody turned to him and began to to say, "I can't breathe." But her fiance already knew she had asthma. He knew what these attacks looked like. And so without even needing to be told, he rushed to the closet, set up her nebulizer, and then put the mask right over her face. And as soon as it was, Jody took in the biggest inhale she possibly could, really believing this was going to stop the asthma attack. But just like the inhaler, the nebulizer didn't work. It felt like with every breath she was taking, her lungs were shrinking, not expanding. And so Jody turned to her fiance and croaked out, "Call an ambulance," her voice barely audible. And so her fiance, who also was now beginning to panic, grabbed the phone, and as he was talking to the dispatcher, trying to relay all the details of what was happening, outside this thunderstorm was only getting worse and worse. The hail and the rain were battering the sides of the house, and all the windows were shaking. I mean, it was absolute bedlam inside of this house. The next few minutes were torture for Jody. She laid on the bed waiting for paramedics. Her breaths at this point were so small, so shallow, like she knew she was about to pass out any second. And then finally the paramedics rushed inside. She knew there were 2 people in the room, but it was so chaotic. And all she could say when they showed up in the room was, "I'm going to die. I'm going to die." The paramedics lifted her off the bed, they put her on the gurney, and as they wheeled her out the door towards the ambulance, her world went totally black. Paramedics rushed Jody to Sunshine Hospital, and on the way, they tried to stabilize her by squeezing these oxygen bags, forcing oxygen into Jody's lungs. And as they were doing that, Jody's fiance was following the ambulance right behind, white-knuckling the steering wheel, praying his fiance was going to survive this asthma attack. When the ambulance finally arrived at Sunshine Hospital, the emergency room was mayhem. Paramedics quickly wheeled Jody in on her gurney, shouting out her vital signs to the doctors waiting near the door. Her fiance, meanwhile, watched helplessly as the medical staff surrounded her and inserted IV lines, hooked up monitors, and began intubating her to force even more oxygen into her lungs. But fortunately, this rapid medical intervention, once Jody got to the hospital, appeared to work, because not long after getting there, Jody did begin to stabilize, not enough to suggest that she was actually all better, but her condition basically began to improve. However, the moment she began to improve, instead of the medical team, talking to her and figuring out what happened and making sure she really was on a path to recovery here, instead, the medical team literally ran out of her room, back out to the front of the ER, because by this point, the Sunshine Hospital ER was overflowing with patients. There were all these people in the waiting room and also outside, and basically everybody had the same symptoms as Jody. They couldn't breathe. There were people slumped on the ground against the wall, screaming for help. I mean, the medical team was totally overwhelmed. And on top of that, there were ambulances literally lined up around the block waiting to drop off patients. There just wasn't any more space. But nonetheless, doctors and nurses and the medical team at the hospital worked furiously, moving from one patient to the next, sometimes in an exam room, sometimes out in the waiting room, sometimes outside. It's wherever the patients were. But the weird thing is all these people, they had the same symptoms, these severe asthma attacks, yet many of the people that were showing up had never had asthma in their lives before. So how was this happening? This went on for hours and hours. And really, the situation in the hospital only continued to get worse, with more and more and more patients showing up with worse and worse symptoms. And so during this madness, Jody, who really hadn't gotten better, she just stabilized, she actually was moved out of the emergency room and over to the ICU, pretty much just to create one more space for new patients. And so in the ICU, Jody's fiance sat next to her, gripping her hand, listening to the sound of the monitors beeping steadily all around her. Outside the room, he could see doctors and nurses and medical staff sprinting up and down the hallways, looking frantic and worried. He had no idea what was happening here. He just hoped Jody would be okay. But it would turn out there actually was someone who knew exactly what was going on. A university researcher named Philip Taylor had actually predicted this the day before. Professor Taylor was an expert in atmospheric allergens, a field so niche that barely anybody outside of his small research circle had even heard of it. And so on the afternoon of November 20th, the day before, Taylor had been at home in his office analyzing data when he noticed something very alarming. All of the ingredients for a catastrophic event were aligning in the forecast, and the patterns were so precise that it stopped him cold. Taylor was stunned. He'd spent years studying the effects of weather on public health, but he'd never seen anything like this before. And at the same time, Taylor also realized that as alarming as this was, very few other people, if anybody, would see this as a problem.
He was like the one person in the world that had the expertise to see how catastrophic this might actually be. And so desperate to warn others, he wound up posting a very urgent announcement on this weather website that he managed. But unfortunately, it just wasn't seen by enough people in time. And so now, as hospitals all across Melbourne overflowed with people gasping for air, Taylor sat in his backyard watching the storm unfold. The sky was pitch black, rain and hail was coming down, the wind was whipping, and off in the distance, all he could hear was thunder and sirens. And he knew, unfortunately, his prediction had been right. Just like Professor Taylor's weather models had predicted, on November 21st, 2016, Melbourne, Australia was hit by an extremely rare event known as thunderstorm asthma. This deadly phenomenon can only occur when three very specific weather conditions align. 1, high heat during the day. 2, a very powerful thunderstorm. And 3, extremely high pollen levels. Melbourne's heat that day had caused unusually high concentrations of ryegrass pollen to hang in the air. And then when that huge thunderstorm rolled in, the intense humidity, the wind, and the rain shattered the pollen grains into microscopic fragments. And then these tiny particles, which were way smaller than regular pollen, were carried by this storm deep into people's homes and into their lungs. Unlike normal pollen, these microscopic fragments bypassed the body's typical defenses and embedded themselves deep into people's lungs, causing severe and sudden asthma attacks. Now, for people who already had asthma, this was catastrophic. But even perfectly healthy people found themselves gasping for air, overwhelmed by the sheer density of this microscopic pollen. The storm had essentially made the air everybody in Melbourne was breathing deadly. As for Jody Santoro, she would spend days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors, with machines pumping oxygen into her lungs while her body fought to heal. But she was lucky. She would eventually recover. And in the days that followed, she would learn the full scale of what actually happened in Melbourne. Nearly 10,000 people had flooded the hospitals across Australia, complaining of the same symptoms that Jody did. And unfortunately, of those 10,000, 10 people actually lost their lives, and many of them were totally healthy and had never had an asthma attack in their lives before. For Jody, despite surviving this ordeal, the awful memory of what happened on that night will forever be on her mind. She is now all too aware of how fragile life can be and how quickly things can change. At about 8:20 in the morning on June 29th, 2025, an 83-year-old woman named June Baxter shuffled her way down the hallway of her small home in Attleborough, which is a quiet town in eastern England. As she walked, she had to keep one hand on the wall to keep her balance. She was pretty frail these days and also just had a lot of medical problems. But she also really valued her independence, and so she was determined to keep living alone, even if it was kind of risky. So June used to live with her husband and their dog. But about 7 years earlier, her husband had gotten really sick, and so because of that, they'd had to give their dog to their granddaughter because they just couldn't take care of it anymore and also care for him. And then unfortunately, June's husband did pass away, and so she was left all alone. But even though she was, all alone in terms of living in the house by herself, she wasn't completely isolated. Her granddaughter, who she had given the dog to, lived close by and visited a whole bunch, and almost always brought along June's old dog, which June loved. Now, in addition to just being good company, June's granddaughter also regularly made herself available to help June with all sorts of basic things, like picking up her prescriptions and going grocery shopping for her and, driving her to and from doctor's appointments. Like, she was really available to her. But despite June knowing that, knowing she could always call on her, she tried hard not to call on her granddaughter, because again, she just really liked being independent. So on this particular day, she, continued slowly walking down the hallway, guiding herself by holding onto the wall, and then she turned the corner to go to the bathroom. And when she stepped inside, she slipped on the tile. And as she was falling to the ground, her leg scraped the corner of the bathroom counter. Immediately, June's leg started bleeding and June's yelling out in pain, but she lives alone, nobody can hear her. And so June quickly went from, just reacting to the pain and the blood. June was scared. I mean, this is the exact scenario that she was so worried about, getting hurt when she was all alone, because she didn't really have a plan. It was like, I'm gonna live alone, so help me. But fortunately for June, She had installed throughout her house all these emergency call bells that would allow her to basically, hit the bell, and they were programmed to contact both her granddaughter and also the local emergency services. And in the bathroom, there was one of these bells. And so once she kind of composed herself a little bit, grabbed the string for this bell, and she pulled it. About 10 minutes later, June was still in the bathroom on the ground, holding onto her leg wound, when she heard the front door of her house swing open. And immediately she heard the sound of her granddaughter calling out for her. And June, as best as she could, even though her voice was a little bit weak, she called out and said where she was. A moment later, June's granddaughter, along with June's old dog she'd brought along, came bombing around the corner, and they looked into the bathroom and they saw, June and her horrible leg wound. And clearly the granddaughter is really worried right away. I mean, this was a very bad cut. But, for June, she's looking at her granddaughter and she's just flooded with relief because she knows no matter how bad this is, her granddaughter is here, everything's fine, and also her dog was here, which made everything better already. And so while June's granddaughter began rummaging through the bathroom to look for some bandages, June just kind of relaxed and just began petting her dog, who was clearly very worried about June. This is her dog previously. They had a very strong bond. And so she's just petting her dog, and then, June's granddaughter did find some bandages and she wrapped up June's leg. And then by the time the paramedics got there, June actually was feeling basically okay. I mean, her leg definitely hurt, but she was very calm at this point. A couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and by this point, June was actually feeling basically back to normal. I mean, her leg definitely still hurt, but again, her granddaughter had put that dressing on it and basically stopped the bleeding, and also June has her dog that she's petting, like her comfort animal. And so she was very calm. Paramedics come in and they assess her and they take off the dressing to check the wound. And after they cleaned it, they said, look, this is a pretty minor cut. You don't even need stitches. I think you're okay. Just be careful and maybe have your granddaughter stay here for a little bit just to make sure you don't fall again. But you're okay. Like, we're going to go. And so June, she thanked the paramedics as they walked out the door. And then she and her granddaughter and the dog just sort of sat there feeling grateful that this fall wasn't more serious. However, the next morning when June woke up, she knew something was wrong because, all she's doing is laying in bed, but her heart is racing, she's sweating, she's lightheaded, like clearly something is off here. Now, the day before, after the paramedics left, her granddaughter did stick around for a little bit, but really, June was okay, and so June was alone. And that night, she had some soreness around the cut, but it really wasn't that serious. She really felt like dodged a bullet there. But now, 12 hours later, something's going on here. Now, June had no way of knowing if her current symptoms were indeed connected to her, minor cut on her leg. But her concern that maybe this was serious and could potentially spiral really quickly made her not pull on one of those emergency bells, but instead she just picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, doctors immediately began running all these tests on her. And very quickly, they determined that she did have a very severe bacterial infection, which she must have gotten after cutting her leg. And unfortunately, that infection had already spread into her blood, which would explain why she was feeling sweaty and lightheaded and why her heart was racing. Now, the medical staff definitely had some questions, like how in the world could this have developed so quickly, especially after the paramedics the day before had, at least according to them, properly cleaned this wound before they left. But, their issue now was not how did this happen, but instead just stabilize June, treat her. And so right away, they began treating June with general antibiotics to try to fight off this infection. But it just wasn't working. And June was 83 and already in relatively poor health, and her condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. So the doctors began running more tests to try to determine exactly what type of bacteria was causing this infection. Because if they knew that, they might be able to give her more targeted treatment than just general antibiotics, which clearly were not working. And they did eventually identify this bacteria. But by the time they did, June had unfortunately already developed sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition that occurs when a person's body tries so hard to fight off an infection that it basically ends up damaging their vital organs in the process. Medical staff did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. And so eventually, 1 week after going to the hospital, June passed away. It would turn out the deadly bacteria that found its way into June's open wound was introduced to her by her granddaughter, completely by accident. The bacteria is called Pasteurella multicida, And it's found in a very specific place, inside the mouths of domestic dogs. While June laid on the bathroom floor waiting for her granddaughter to find bandages to wrap up her leg, June's old beloved dog, who her granddaughter had brought over, was trying to comfort June, and June was allowing the dog to do that. But what the dog was actually doing to comfort June, was licking her open wound. And so that led to the bacteria going in, and it would kill June 1 week later. The early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, a 62-year-old woman named Augusta Roblin lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone, and at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes. Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams, and so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was, living with her daughter. But on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares, but she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now, normally one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares. And sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to, and she was in her daughter's basement. So in the basement of the house she was in right now. And in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over. And she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her, and they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men, and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet seemingly out of nowhere, and the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta, and they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here, and she was horrified. So she woke up. And now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night, and she would get up in the morning and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. But over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally, at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours, give or take, from when Augusta had this dream, right? They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating, she seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, "Mom, what is going on with you?" And Augusta, at this point, realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, "Don't worry, I'm fine, I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine, I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine." But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said, okay. And they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her, and she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, really, what's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm going to stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags, so she called a doctor. And a doctor came to the house, and a doctor examined Augusta, and they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching, and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of, and she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she said to her mom, "You gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know." Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not gonna take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, "I had that dream again. Except this time, I watched the procedure." Now, to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so. But it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these two bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now, she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. She knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then she, not two men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now, on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream. But there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was gonna die next. And so every time she had this dream, she knew someone's gonna die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly, she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta. In that dream, it was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, i.e. putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it. And Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream's taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house. On the afternoon of March 4th, 2000, a 40-year-old woman named Ines Ramirez stood in the kitchen of her tiny one-room home, which was deep in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. Ines had a whole chicken on the counter right in front of her that she had just killed and plucked, and now she was using a 6-inch long knife to butcher it for their dinner. And as she did this, every once in a while, she would look out the window to check on her 7 kids who were playing together out in the yard. So Ines and her large family lived in a very isolated rural community of about maybe 500 people. They didn't have running water or electricity or a phone, and they lived miles away from their closest neighbors. They mainly lived off of corn and vegetables that they grew themselves, chickens they raised, and then wild animals that Enos's husband would catch. Her husband was actually gone that day because he was out in the mountains hunting for deer. And so as Enos is just kind of going about her fairly typical evening routine here, making dinner, she suddenly felt this really intense, very painful cramping sensation that was kind of ripping through her abdomen. And it hurt so bad that Enos stopped what she was doing and kind of doubled over and grabbed the counter and just tried to steady her breathing. I mean, this was really shocking. And for about a minute, Enos just stood there, holding onto the counter, just waiting for this pain to pass, and eventually it did. And once it eased up, it was like, okay, she was back to normal and she could stand up again. But this was sort of alarming. But at the same time, Enos was used to dealing with basically all medical crises on her own. They lived in this isolated part of the world, and the nearest medical clinic was 50 miles away, and they didn't have a car. So, like anything that happened, they basically had to deal with it themselves, and that was routine. And so for Enos, despite how incredibly painful this was, she just told herself, now that it had passed, the pain was gone, she said, you know what? It's probably fine. I'm good. And so pretty quickly, she just kind of forgot about it and went back to butchering the chicken. But several hours later, this is after midnight now, the pain came right back. And at this point, Enos, she's in this one common room in her house where all her kids are fast asleep. It's past midnight now, and she's sitting on this bench and she's gripping her abdomen, rocking back and forth as this pain just rockets back and forth across her abdomen constantly. There's no relief, nothing. And she's trying so hard not to make a sound because she doesn't want to wake her kids up, nor does she want to scare her kids. Her husband is still off in the mountains hunting for deer, so she is alone. She just has this little flickering candle nearby. That's the only light she's got, and she's just isolated, dealing with this excruciating pain. And so at this point, Enos really felt like this could be a real problem. This might not be something she could just brush off and let pass on its own. This was real. This was an actual emergency. But what can she even do? There's nowhere to go. She can't do anything. She is just completely trapped here with this excruciating pain that's making it hard to even have coherent thought. It's so bad. But the one thought that kept going through her mind was she had to do something, or whatever this was. It felt like it was going to kill her. And so Enos felt like she really only had one option here, and it was a horrible, horrible option. But she knew she had to do it. And so she got up and she's hunched over in pain, and as quietly as she could, she walked over to a cabinet and she opened it up and she grabbed a small bottle of alcohol. And she took a few sips to kind of numb the pain a little bit. And then after she had done that, she turned around and, still with this blinding pain, she hobbled into the kitchen and she grabbed that 6-inch knife she had used earlier to butcher the chicken. And then she walked right back over to the bench near that candle that she'd been sitting on earlier. And once she was there, she reached down and she pulled up her shirt, exposing her abdomen, where this pain was coming from. And then she took the knife and she plunged it into her abdomen. And immediately she let out this blood-curdling scream. She couldn't help it. And she was sort of vaguely aware of all her kids waking up and sort of making their way over to her, but she was so focused on what she was doing, and she began slowly dragging this blade down her abdomen all the way to her belly button. And then she pulled out the knife and she can barely think. It's so painful. Her kids are crying. And then she plunged the knife back into her abdomen and raked it down the other side, creating this massive gash in her stomach. And then she kind of dropped the knife and she's screaming. She can't even help it, and her kids are all crying. And she takes her hand and she reaches into her stomach and she's fishing around. Every little move is like lightning striking her body. But she eventually finds what she's looking for and she pulls it out of her stomach. And what she's looking at is her 8th child, a baby boy. And she had enough wherewithal to take that knife and cut the umbilical cord and place the baby down before she passed out. After Enos lost consciousness, one of her kids left the house and just started running to go find the nearest person to get some help. And miraculously, after finding some people, when those first responders got to the home where Enos was, hours later, they found her and her newborn son alive. And they were taken to the closest hospital for emergency treatment, and they would both make full recoveries. Today, Ines Ramirez is the only woman ever who has performed a successful C-section on herself. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, a 62-year-old woman named Augusta Roblin lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone, and at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes. Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams, and so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was, living with her daughter. But on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares, but she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now, normally one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares. And sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to, and she was in her daughter's basement. So in the basement of the house she was in right now. And in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over. And she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her, and they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men, and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet seemingly out of nowhere, and the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta, and they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here, and she was horrified. So she woke up. And now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night, and she would get up in the morning and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. But over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally, at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours, give or take, from when Augusta had this dream, right? They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating, she seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, "Mom, what is going on with you?" And Augusta, at this point, realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, "Don't worry, I'm fine, I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine, I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine." But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said, okay. And they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her, and she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, really, what's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm going to stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags. So she called a doctor. And a doctor came to the house, and a doctor examined Augusta, and they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of, and she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she said to her mom, "You gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know." Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not gonna take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, "I had that dream again. Except this time, I watched the procedure." Now, to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so. But it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these two bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now, she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. She knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then she, not two men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now, on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream. But there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was gonna die next. And so every time she had this dream, she knew someone's gonna die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly, she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta. In that dream, it was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, i.e. putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it. And Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream's taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house.
Afternoon of September 29th, 1988, a 10-year-old boy named Francisco was walking along the perimeter of a man-made lake in southern Brazil while poking the ground with his stick. Francisco was doing one of his favorite after-school activities, which was looking for bugs. And this lake, which was a part of the Billings Reservoir in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, was his favorite place to do that. And the reservoir was gigantic, but it was not shaped like a typical circular lake. Instead, it was more like a big river that kind of wound around and had all these skinny branches kind of jutting off the sides of it. And on this particular day, Francisco was walking along one of those skinny offshoots of this lake, where at certain points, if Francisco wanted to, he could literally swim to the other side of the lake in a matter of minutes. Now, Francisco knew he was not really supposed to be anywhere near this reservoir, because in recent years, gangs from the nearby cities would bring their murder victims out to this reservoir and bury them here. And so locals knew it was not a safe place and to stay clear. But Francisco, he didn't listen to any of that because he loved walking around this lake and looking for bugs. And so he thought, you know what? no one's harmed me yet, so what's the big deal? And so, as Francisco casually walked along, poking at the mud, looking for his bugs, he finally saw one. It was a huge water scorpion, almost 2 inches long, and so immediately Francisco, without taking his eyes off the bug, drops his backpack, grabs a clear container that he kept in the side pocket, he opened it up, he bent down, and he scooped up this water scorpion and capped it, and then he brought the container up and looked inside to kind of admire his new pet. And as he was staring at this container, he noticed something odd on the other side of the lake. He basically saw it through the plastic container, and so he lowered the container to get a better look at this strange thing on the other side of the water, and what he saw was this big group of vultures all kind of standing in a circle right on the water's edge. And immediately, Francisco was way more interested in these vultures than in his bug, because vultures meant there had to be a dead thing nearby, because vultures are scavengers. And so whatever they were circled around was probably a dead animal. But Francisco, he looked around and realized there was no way to get to the other side of the water to see whatever this dead thing was unless he swam. And he knew if he went back home with soaking wet clothes, his mom would know he had snuck to the reservoir and he'd be in lots of trouble. And so, feeling really frustrated, Francisco just picked up a rock and chucked it to the other side, trying to splash the water near the vultures to get them to fly away so he could see the dead thing. But the first rock he threw did not really have an effect. The vultures just kind of turned around and looked at him and then went back to whatever was on the ground. And so Francisco gathered a big pile of like 25 rocks and began throwing them one after the other at these vultures. And finally, Francisco had caused enough chaos on the other side of the water that the vultures got upset and they took to the air and they flew away. And finally, Francisco got a clear view of the dead thing that was in the middle of the circle of vultures. Now, initially, Francisco thought this dead thing was going to be maybe a bird or some other small animal from the area, but when he got a good look at this dead thing from 30 feet away, it didn't look like either of those things. It didn't have fur, it didn't have feathers, it actually looked kind of pale, almost like a pig. But Francisco's thinking to himself, why would a pig be all the way out here? And then it slowly dawned on Francisco that what he was looking at was actually a dead person. Suddenly terrified, Francisco scooped up his things, turned around, and ran to the nearest village where he began screaming for help. Within a few hours, the area along the water where the vultures had been and where this body was swarming with police and also with curious villagers. Normally, when a body was discovered in or near this reservoir, which unfortunately happened quite a bit because of all the recent gang violence, police would often break ranks from the investigation and walk over to the local onlookers and kind of fill them in and tell them, who this person was and what they think happened. But this time, it was totally different. The police were totally secretive, and it was really obvious. The police immediately roped off the entire area with crime scene tape, and then the police officers stood in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, blocking the view of the villagers so they couldn't see the body. And then when villagers actually walked up to police and said, "Hey, can you tell us what's going on?" the police would say they couldn't talk about it, and then they would tell the villagers to back up and stay away. Locals would stick around for a while, being treated this way the entire time by police, and then finally when the sun started to go down and it was clear the police were very committed to hiding what was going on, whoever was still there finally just left, figuring when they got home they could just turn on the news and see what had happened with this dead person. But when they got home and turned on their TV, there was not one news story about this body. And at a minimum, this story should have dominated local news, but it somehow was not being talked about. And then even stranger was the next morning when locals got up, they headed back to the reservoir to see what the police were up to. And when they got there, they found the police were gone, the body was gone, and there was absolutely no trace that anyone or anything had ever been there. It was like it had been totally sanitized. For days, locals in this area continued to check the TV news, they checked the radio, the newspapers for some story, some bit of information about this dead body that was found. But again, there was just absolutely nothing, and it just made no sense. Why wasn't anyone talking about this? And so eventually, in the absence of any official information about what happened, a rumor began to circulate among locals that the body belonged to a local fisherman who had gone missing 3 days before Francisco discovered him. And this fisherman, apparently he was an alcoholic, and he had gone to the reservoir and he had begun drinking, and apparently he drank so much that it killed him. Now, many people wondered, if this drunk fisherman story was the real story, then why were the police so secretive about the body, and why weren't they willing to give up any information to the crowd about what had happened to this guy? I mean, a drunk fisherman is not a super sensitive thing. It just seemed like that doesn't line up with the police's behavior. But questions like these remained unanswered, and after several weeks of still no new information, no news coverage anywhere, even the most skeptical of villagers who really thought there's something weird going on here, they just kind of forgot about it and moved on. Until 6 years later, in 1994, when someone, we don't know who, from the Brazilian government decided they just couldn't keep the secret any longer. And so they gathered up some photos and an autopsy report they were not supposed to have, and they smuggled those things to the media. And once the media published these things, it became immediately clear that the dead man who was found in the reservoir in 1988 was not a drunk fisherman who drank himself to death, nor was he the victim of gang violence. Instead, it appeared that this person's death could potentially be paranormal. But before we dive into the significance of those leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report, you need to understand a weird aspect of Brazil's history. Brazil has an absolutely astounding number of sightings of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs for short. And these are not your typical UFO stories where some person claims they saw aliens or they were abducted by aliens, but they have no witnesses, they have no proof, they have nothing but their own story. No, in Brazil, the bulk of their UFO sightings are reported by their military, because Brazil actually has a government program to monitor UFO sightings because it happens so much in their country. In fact, the Brazilian government was directly involved in one of the most famous UFO sightings of all time. It was called the Night of the UFOs. This famous sighting, or sightings, because it actually happened in 4 different Brazilian states simultaneously, happened on May 19th, 1986, which was 2 years before Francisco spotted the dead body in the reservoir. On that 1986 day, at around 8:15 p.m., an air traffic controller at an international airport in Sao Paulo noticed 3 red lights hovering over the airport, and so the controller called it in and asked, what are these things? But nobody knew. And at the exact same time, all across Brazil, dozens and dozens of other people who have no idea what's happening at this international airport began reporting that they too were seeing strange lights in the sky. And many of these reports of these lights were coming from military personnel and government officials. And so this was like a really big deal that all across Brazil, everybody's seeing lights in the sky. And so the government, in response to this, scrambled their fighter jets and sent the jets up to try to intercept one of these sets of lights, just to see who or what they were and potentially shoot them down if they had to. But when these jets got anywhere close to these unidentified flying objects, these lights in the sky, these UFOs would move away instantly. One UFO was observed suddenly disappearing and then reappearing 20 miles away in just 5 seconds, which meant that UFO had to travel at least 5 times the speed of sound to cover that distance in such a short amount of time. For reference, humans are not capable of going that fast. We cannot do that. Eventually, the night of the UFOs ended when all these UFOs, these lights in the sky, just kind of suddenly vanished. And then a couple of days later, the Brazilian government held this big press conference about the event, and they would say, we have no idea what those lights were or where they came from. We have no clue. However, whoever or whatever was controlling these UFOs showed obvious signs of intelligence. Now, as mind-blowing as that would be to hear that potentially intelligent creatures are flying around your airspace, remember, this is Brazil, where UFO sightings were kind of the norm, and so people were definitely shocked by this. This was a terrifying thing, but they just kind of accepted what they were told and assumed, the government will handle this, and people moved on with their lives. That is, until several years later in 1994, when those photos and the autopsy report of the dead person in the reservoir were leaked, and then suddenly the people of Brazil, they're seeing this stuff and they're realizing, wait a minute, the night of the UFOs may not have been an isolated instance. Those UFOs may never have left. Here is what the public learned from the leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report. Back in 1988, when little Francisco spotted the dead body from the other side of the water, he correctly identified that it was a man's body. But Francisco had been wrong when he told authorities that it didn't look like this guy had any visible injuries on him. And the guy was naked, and so Francisco felt pretty confident that he would have seen something if the guy was wounded. But when the police arrived and they saw the body up close, they immediately saw he had several very serious and very strange physical injuries. He had these 4 perfectly circular 1 to 1.5 inch diameter holes drilled into his body. There were 2 right above his chest, basically sitting above his armpit. There was one that was right over his belly button, so his belly button was gone. It was just a hole where it had been. And there was also one in his crotch. And these holes were not crudely done. These were done with surgical precision, almost like whoever had done it was using high-end medical tools to make these cuts. Now, at first glance, the authorities had no idea why these holes were on this guy's body. But when the autopsy was done, they discovered this man was missing the majority of his internal organs, and after doing some investigating, they discovered that all of his organs had literally been vacuumed out of him through these holes on his body. Those holes were basically just ports to pull things out of him. Also, most of the man's blood had been suctioned out of those holes as well. But that wasn't all. The man also had one of his ears removed, one of his eyes was removed, and the lower part of his face was also removed. And again, all of these cuts looked like they had been made with absolute surgical precision. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of all the things that came to light when these documents were leaked was something that, unless you looked really closely at the autopsy report, you wouldn't necessarily notice. And it had to do with this man's vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve is something that controls part of your nervous system that's responsible for automatic functions like heart rate and digestion. And so when your body is suddenly in great distress, like suddenly you're fighting for your life or something, your vagus nerve can basically shut off those automatic functions like digestion in order to ensure all your energy is going towards fighting for your life. But in this dead man's case, his autopsy revealed that his vagus nerve had gone absolutely wild right at the moment of his death. It's complicated, but this suggests that this man was very likely alive when his face was being surgically cut off, and those holes were being drilled into his body, and his organs were being vacuumed out. And then at some point, the excruciating pain that came from these horrible things happening to him got so bad, his vagus nerve basically turned off his heart. So it was not these horrible physical injuries that killed him. He literally died from the pain of these physical injuries. In short, his body basically killed itself to avoid feeling the pain it was feeling. So I'm sure you're wondering, how does the dead man in the reservoir and these leaked photos and the autopsy report, how does all of that connect with the night of the UFOs, which happened 2 years before the man in the reservoir was even found? Well, following the night of the UFOs in 1986, farmers in Brazil who lived in the areas where these famous sightings took place began reporting that their cattle were dying kind of inexplicably. And this began happening with enough frequency in all of these areas where the UFO sightings had taken place that a theory began to develop in Brazil that maybe the UFOs that were here during the night of the UFOs have something to do with all these cows turning up dead. And as that theory began to take hold all across Brazil, that, UFOs are killing our cattle, another theory began to come out of that one, which was, well, if the UFOs are coming in here and killing cattle, what's stopping them from killing people? And then in 1988, so 2 years after the night of the UFOs, and right in the middle of all these farmers all across Brazil saying their cows were dying for no reason, the dead man in the reservoir was discovered. And as soon as the government saw the physical condition this guy was in, with the weird holes drilled in his body and his organs missing and his face pulled off, that, plus the fact that he was located in this reservoir, which by the way was in a Night of the UFO sighting area, the government decided they would have to hide the story. A critical detail that I have left out intentionally until right now is that the cattle who were turning up dead, they were turning up dead with circular holes drilled into their bodies, with organs missing and parts of their faces removed. Meaning, clearly, whatever was happening to these cattle inside of these sighting areas had happened to this man in the reservoir. And if that got out to the public, then it would confirm for many people in Brazil that, yep, the UFOs, they're the ones going after the cattle, and now they're going after us too. And so this was why the police were so secretive about the body and not letting anybody see it or learn anything about it. And it was also why no news was run anywhere in Brazil about the story. It's because the government was really trying to make sure it did not get out. And the government was able to keep it quiet until 1994, when those photos and the autopsy report were leaked. But like all things having to do with UFOs or aliens or paranormal stuff, it's like despite the evidence, those things very quickly are pushed into the kind of conspiracy theory bucket and they stay there. People do not want to touch that category. So, even though Brazil remains an absolute hotbed for UFO sightings, Wikipedia even has a page dedicated just to tracking Brazilian UFO sightings, despite all that, no one really cares. But if you care, there is an unbelievable amount of information online about what's going on in Brazil, and if nothing else, it is just a fascinating rabbit hole to fall into. Cold night of February 8th, 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan sat around this roaring fire with a big group of men inside of this valley in western Colorado. The men around the fire, including Israel, were all gold prospectors, which meant they traveled the western United States looking for gold. But over the past several weeks, this group of prospectors had been trapped in this valley because of all the terrible winter storms. They had these storms coming in that each time would dump up to 6 feet of snow. But on this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire, enjoying the flames and hearing people tell stories, one of Israel's friends, one of the other gold prospectors, whose name was Alfred Packer, he stood up and basically pitched the whole group as to why they should come with him and leave the valley right now. Basically, Alfred told the group that, the weather is starting to turn a bit, it's not as bad anymore, the snow's starting to melt. And Alfred said, I know a pathway out of here that will take us out of this valley in just 2 weeks, and it'll bring us right to Breckenridge, Colorado, which was an area that was known by prospectors for having lots and lots of gold. And so Alfred's basically telling them, this is a win-win. We can get out of here sooner, and we can get rich. After Alfred made this pitch, he sat back down, and everybody just stayed quiet for a second. And Israel, he kind of looked around and watched to see if anybody would take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't like Alfred. They said he was lazy and difficult. But Israel felt like that was really not the reason they did not like his friend. He believed the reason other people did not like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy, which meant he periodically had seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability for journeys like this, where, the whole group really needs to rely on everybody, and everybody needs to pull their own weight. And so they were kind of worried about a guy who at any moment could just become kind of useless because he was having a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy really didn't matter. He didn't feel like Alfred was some huge liability. He felt like Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. And so for him to stand up and make this pitch just kind of felt like in keeping with who he was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to naturally go with Alfred and do his big plan, but he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing out the pros and cons of, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire and he saw one of the men, this really big guy, was sitting there looking really serious and just shaking his head slowly back and forth like, no, you guys can't be considering leaving early. And then the big guy stood up and he held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically telling him, don't say another word. And then this guy, while still looking at Alfred, he said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And then this big guy sat back down again, and then everybody around the fire just sat there really tense for a few seconds in total silence. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different than the rest of the people sitting around this fire. His name was Eerie, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabawatch band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Eerie had actually saved the lives of everybody, Israel and Alfred included, who was sitting around this fire. Because a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up lost in this valley, which was the valley where Chief Eerie lived with his tribe, and he had found them stumbling around on the brink of death with all the snow coming down. And so Chief Eerie and his people brought the prospectors some food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river, and then Chief Eerie told them to stay put in this campsite and ride out the winter, and then in the springtime, when the snow melts, it'll be safe for you all to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were only thankful and just totally psyched that Chief Eerie had found them and given them this campsite. I mean, this was great. And so they had no problem agreeing to, wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being kind of trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried if they didn't leave soon, there'd be no more gold for them to mine. And for Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold, because he had told his family that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. And so he really couldn't go home empty-handed. He literally needed the gold in order to continue to survive and take care of his family. So when Alfred stood up and broke the kind of tense silence and said to Chief Eerie, thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early and I just hope others will come with me. At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred, and Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. And so Israel said, you know what? I'll go with you as well. And then after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Eerie could tell he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. And so even though he felt like this was a terrible idea, he shifted his focus from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were going to go into. And so he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him, and then Chief Eerie drew a map in the dirt on the ground, and he told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that you have to follow the river out of here. It'll bring you to this mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range, and you cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You got to follow that river and go around the mountain range. And then once you do, on the other side, there will be an outpost where you can stop, get supplies, rest, and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then after Chief Eerie had explained all this, he made sure to mark an X on his dirt map exactly where the outpost would be. And then Chief Eerie just turned around and walked over to his horse and rode away. And then shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for the night. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors who had not volunteered to go with them, who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward and said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go, using his horse. But at some point he would need to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. And so the men were very thankful about this. And so shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out of the valley, they began to see off in the distance the huge jagged mountains of the San Juan mountain range. But they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path, because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. And as Israel trudged through the snow in a line of men, he held on to a coffee pot, a metal coffee pot that he kept hot coals inside of. This not only kept his hands warm, but also if he ran out of matches, he could easily start a fire using the coals. It was an old trick he had learned. And so as he's clutching this magnificent warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him, and so he turned around and he saw it was Alfred. And he looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel was. And so without even thinking about it, Israel just handed off his warm coffee pot to Alfred. And Alfred took it and clutched it and was obviously so thankful. Now, none of these gold prospectors had struck it rich. They were all basically poor. But of all these gold prospectors, Alfred really had the least of all of them. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. And also, Alfred was half the age of Israel. Alfred was 30 years old. And so Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid trying to find his way. Alfred had also confided in Israel that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions because he wanted to fight the slave-holding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they kicked Alfred out for his epilepsy. But that had not stopped Alfred from tattooing on his arm his battalion information and his name. And unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he misspelled his name when he gave it to the tattoo artist. And so when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D. And from that point on, that was his name. Nobody called him Alfred, they called him Alfred. And so this was kind of embarrassing for him. And then after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help. And so after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a flask with some alcohol in it, and he handed it to Israel, almost like a thank you for giving me this warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing back and forth the flask and the coffee pot. And then by late afternoon that day, when the snow was really starting to come down, the prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he had finally reached a point where he said, my horse can't go any farther, the weather's too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies, and then he turned and headed back down the trail. And very likely, as these men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the same thought. I just gotta suck it up for 2 weeks to get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge, and I will become rich. 2 weeks would pass by, and Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Uray had pointed out, which was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was going to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by, and still they did not show up at the outpost, and they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving, it was snowing less, but within a couple of days of this group setting off on the trip, those winter storms came back with a vengeance and just dumped snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey was the men themselves, and then also Chief Uray and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay in the valley until spring. But even if Chief Uray and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in trouble, they would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley and basically couldn't do anything. And so in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 men were totally lost somewhere out in the wild, but nobody knew. But that would all change on April 16th, 1874, roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast in one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating and talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open, and these officials, they turn around and they see standing in the doorway is this totally disheveled looking guy with long hair that's sticking up in the air and a huge bushy beard. And in one hand, he's got a rifle, and in the other hand, he's got a metal coffee pot. And his eyes were darting like crazy side to side, and he was clearly in shock, and he was trying to speak, but he just couldn't. This man was Alfred. And it was obvious to the officials that this man is in dire need of help. And so without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door, got him some food, got him some water, and immediately Alfred's wolfing down the food as fast as he can until he began vomiting, at which point he apologized profusely and said, I've been starving out in the wild for weeks, and, it must have done something to my intestinal tract, it's probably damaged. But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over the ground. They were worried this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put in warm clothes. And then Alfred asked them, do you have any whiskey? I want to kind of warm my body up. And they said, no problem. They handed him some whiskey. And so Alfred threw a couple of shots back. And then after that, it was pretty obvious that Alfred had kind of relaxed a little bit. And then at that point, one of the officials asked Alfred, what happened to you? As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials that he had been with 5 men and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge, Colorado to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, this huge storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the trail they were on. And so the group decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range. The thing Chief Urey said, don't do that, do not go over the mountains. They decided to do that. But as they were traversing these treacherous mountains, it was clear that Alfred was just not keeping up with the group. And so unfortunately, they made the decision to leave Alfred behind to die. And he knew he was being abandoned to die. And so he had to watch as his 5 friends, disappeared into the snow. But amazingly, Alfred did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going, eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. And so at night, he was able to start fires. And then also at one point, he was so hungry that he cooked his leather shoes in the fire and ate them because, again, this guy is starving. And so really, he was on the brink of death when he randomly stumbled into this outpost and found this cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent. And Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive? And they would say, no, it's only you. We have not seen anybody else. Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away, mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It's been 2 months since they started that journey. The chances are just not good that they have survived. But even if these other men were not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search because he's the only one who knows where they could be. But Alfred was not healthy enough to go out in the wild and lead a search. And so for several weeks, Alfred just stayed in the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men. On August 20th, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado, roughly in the area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible smell. And so John followed the smell until it brought him to this clearing, and then in the clearing was what looked like an old beat-up campsite. And so, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who was in this campsite. But when he turned the corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze. Because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in shock from what he's seeing, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether, and the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically skeletons, but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lively that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away,
But he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies. And when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chest, looked surgical, like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away was the remains of a burned out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods, and he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there, but it had all the signs of someone living here for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together, and John realized what he had just stumbled on. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered, and the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This is like a cannibal camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy going to come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook, he sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out John, the illustrator, was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was left behind to die, those 5 other men carried on into the night up into the mountains, and then somebody attacked them, began killing them, and eating them. And that person was Alfred. That was why Alfred had survived for so long. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night, it was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even when he killed these 5 men. All we know is that based on the investigation, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered, but the 5th victim, who actually was Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was self-defense, and somebody else killed the other 4. It was kind of confusing. Despite those claims he had, the one thing Alfred never denied was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat. In fact, when they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But despite it being right there, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 92 years old, he was granted parole, and right away, Alfred became a vegetarian and then died a few years later. From the 1800s all the way through the 1900s, Bodmin's St. Lawrence Hospital was one of the largest running asylums in all of England. But in 2002, it was permanently shut down due to so many accusations of patient mistreatment. Now, after it was shut down, the property kind of fell into disrepair. It was basically abandoned. And so when it became totally overgrown, it began attracting vandals and urban explorers. And so the owners of the property finally just put up a fence all the way around the hospital, and they hired security guards to patrol the property. A.M. on December 21st, 2003, 3 young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds
Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m., they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the Top End. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two. So it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one, they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it. And then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the Top End, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the Top End assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the Top End take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these 3 friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these 3 guys, they grew up in the Top End. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finnis River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, what, we've been there, done that. Nothing's going to happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finnis River were very, very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finnis River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. We'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest. And while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. And they rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment. And suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now, all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into. Because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out. And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? You know, they're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now, the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water, and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. He is face down, and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth, and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean, as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water, back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence, and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search, and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, you know, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight, or tomorrow will be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze. And he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree, in that black water, is the 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these two teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy. And then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs, and finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on. And then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area, and so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other, and then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile. And so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash, they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile.
In late 2003, a 22-year-old man named Michael Bridges sat down in the stands of a professional hockey game in Calgary, which is a major city in Canada. And as he sat there staring out at the rink, waiting for the players to file in, he thought to himself how amazing it was that he was here right now. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to be here. So Michael lived about 700 miles away in a city called Brandon, which is also in Canada. And for the last year, Michael's life had gone really badly. He was struggling financially and in between jobs. He had gone through a recent terrible breakup. A lot of his friends had sort of vanished from his life. And so for the most part, he was sort of sad and lonely all the time. But then he'd won a sweepstakes that he had only entered on a whim and gotten an all expenses paid trip to Calgary for this hockey game. And so it felt like finally something good was happening in his life. Michael was about to flag down a vendor and order himself a beer when this guy he didn't know, this stocky guy with a mustache, walked in and sat down right next to Michael. And before Michael could say anything, this guy looked at him with a big smile on his face and he said, "Man, I'm so excited to be here. I won this ticket in a sweepstakes." And Michael was like, "Dude, me too." And so right away, these total strangers just totally hit it off. And before long, they were chatting about their lives. And, Michael, who over the last year, most of his friends had sort of disappeared in his life, it was great to have a guy that just seemed to get him. And so the time flew by. And Brock must have felt the same way about Michael, because as the hockey game ended, Brock asked Michael if he wanted to, keep the party going and go together to a strip club right down the road. And Michael was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And so the two new friends left the hockey game together, they went to the strip club, and as soon as they got there, Michael began to notice something odd about Brock, or at least something he hadn't noticed before. And that was that even though Brock appeared to be very blue collar, sort of like Michael was, Brock appeared to have a lot of money. I mean, he was leaving these huge tips for all the bartenders, and he was paying for he and Michael's drinks round after round. Brock was paying for all of it. And then also, Brock had this huge wad of ones and bills that he was basically throwing at all the dancers. And Michael, who was caught off guard by this, gladly accepted Brock's generosity. I mean, at this point, given Michael's financial struggles, he could not have afforded even a normal night out, let alone a lavish one like this. And so as the two men stood at the bar towards the end of the night, Michael thanked Brock for making this such a fun night, and he said he really didn't want to leave and go back to his hometown of Brandon, 700 miles away, because he was having so much fun here with Brock. But when he said Brandon, Brock stopped and he's like, "Wait a minute, Brandon? I'm moving to Brandon for work." And when Michael heard this, he was ecstatic. I mean, he was thinking this was going to be a one-off thing, that he would likely never see Brock again, despite how cool this guy was. But now it seemed entirely possible that if they were living in the same town, they could be actual friends. And so Brock told Michael that, "Hey, if you help me find an apartment in your hometown once I move there, maybe I can repay the favor by helping you get some work." And so Michael, he took one last look at that big wad of cash in Brock's hand, and he looked up at him and he said, "Deal." A couple of months later, in early December of 2003, Michael rode in the passenger seat of Brock's car as they made their way down a road in Brandon. The two had just had lunch together, and Brock was driving Michael home, when suddenly Brock's phone rang. And when Brock answered it, Michael could tell right away, just from the tone of Brock's voice, that he was speaking to his boss. So ever since that hockey game, Michael and Brock had become friends. Brock had moved to Brandon, and Michael had helped him find an apartment, and in exchange, Brock had made good on his promise and had helped Michael find some work. In fact, he had gotten him a few odd jobs with the company that he, Brock, worked for. However, these jobs were not what Michael expected them to be, based on, his first impression of Brock. In reality, he felt like these jobs were kinda shady. Brock had asked Michael to start delivering these packages all over town, but he warned Michael to never look inside of any of these packages. Now, at first, obviously, Michael had been very unsure about taking Brock up on these jobs. I mean, it was pretty clear that whatever Brock was doing was, questionable or maybe even illegal. Like, what's going on with these packages? But, Michael thought back to that huge wad of cash that Brock had at the strip club in Calgary, and it just seemed like he was throwing money around, and Michael wanted money like that too. And so he thought, what's the harm? And so ultimately, Michael agreed to deliver one of these packages, and when nothing bad happened, he began delivering more. Now, Michael still had no idea what he was actually delivering. He had heeded the warning and was not looking inside these packages. Instead, he had sort of accepted the shadowy, mysterious stuff that Brock was doing was just sort of part of being friends with Brock and working for Brock. And so he had just gone along with it. And also, Michael genuinely needed the money. He really couldn't afford to just stop working. So as the two men continued down this road in Brandon, Michael just continued to sit quietly in the passenger seat while he listened to Brock speak to his boss. And at some point in this conversation, Brock looked very resigned and just said, "Okay, I'll take care of it right now." Then Brock abruptly hung up, and without saying anything to Michael, he just pulled a U-turn and began speeding in the opposite direction. And then a couple of minutes later, Brock pulled into this parking lot of the seedy hotel, and then before Michael could ask, what are we doing here? Brock turned to him and said, "You stay here." And then Brock got out of the car, and he marched over to the door of this motel and began to knock. And Michael, he's in the car watching this, having no idea what's going on, and he sees the motel room door that Brock knocked on, it suddenly opened, and there was this woman who was inside the motel, and from Michael's perspective, it seemed like she was very startled to see Brock. And then she began trying to shut the door on Brock. But Brock, he reached out and he began pushing on the door to keep it open, and the two of them began yelling at each other. And Michael, he can't hear what they're yelling about, but clearly, they're having some sort of heated argument here. And at this point, Michael began looking around, hopeful that nobody was witnessing this. I mean, they could get in some serious trouble here. And then Michael turned his attention back to Brock and this woman, and he watched as Brock raised his fist and punched this woman square in the face. And she instantly crumpled to the ground, and Michael, he has no idea what to do here. And so he just sat there as Brock climbed on top of this woman who's laying on the ground, and he began repeatedly punching her over and over again until Michael could see blood all over her face. And then Brock, who seemed totally unfazed, slammed the motel room door and calmly walked back to the car, hopped in the driver's seat, and drove off without saying anything to Michael. And Michael just sat quietly for this ride. He really had no idea what to even say. Now, he already knew that Brock must be involved in some sort of criminal enterprise, and in virtue of Michael delivering those packages for him, he was also involved in whatever this organization did. But up until this point, up until seeing this beating take place, Michael had sort of assumed that whatever Brock was involved in couldn't be that big of a deal. I mean, certainly they weren't hurting people. But now, Michael realized he had been terribly wrong. Finally, Brock pulled up in front of Michael's house, and for the first time he spoke. He turned to Michael and he said, "Don't tell anyone what you saw." And Michael just nodded his head and said, "Yeah, I won't." And then Michael got out of the car and he rushed inside his house. Michael was at his home when his phone rang, and when he looked at the caller ID, he saw it was Brock. And at first, Michael couldn't help but feel like he didn't want to pick up the call, but he knew he would have to. Despite what had happened the previous week at the motel, Michael had not said anything to anyone. However, being loyal to Brock did not make him feel any better about it. In reality, Michael felt like at this point, he was in too deep with Brock, and he had no idea how to get out again, even though at this point he kind of wanted to. But for now, Michael had made the conscious decision to simply act like everything is the same, everything is normal, so he didn't raise any red flags with Brock. And so he ultimately picked up the phone. Brock didn't say hello or ask Michael how he was doing. Instead, he just told Michael that he had another delivery for him if Michael was still committed to this job. Now, Michael knew the right answer here would be to turn this down and not continue to go down this rabbit hole and get deeper and deeper in with Brock. But at the same time, Michael was worried if he refused this job that he might be put in danger. Like, he saw what Brock was capable of. Is that going to happen to him if he turns this down? And then on top of that, Michael needed the money. And so after a tense silence, Michael told Brock that yes, I'm still committed and I will do this delivery. Brock said that was very good. And he also told Michael that he and the boss were very impressed with Michael's silence. And then Brock hung up. Now, Michael did appreciate the compliment, but at the same time, it really did not change his situation at all. I mean, he was still in way too deep here and didn't know what he was going to do. And so reluctantly, he grabbed his keys and headed out to his car to go pick up this next package. 2 months later, in early February of 2004, Michael and Brock sat inside of a diner in Brandon eating a meal together. Things at this point had basically gone back to normal. Michael was regularly delivering packages for Brock, and the two of them were meeting for meals like this fairly often, where Brock would always foot the bill. But today, as Michael sat there staring at Brock, he could tell something was different. Brock seemed really agitated, like something was on his mind. He kept tapping his hand and kind of fidgeting in his seat. And eventually, Michael asked Brock, like, hey, are you okay? And to Michael's surprise, Brock kind of lit up. And he was like, oh yeah, I'm okay. In fact, things are more than okay. I actually have an offer for you that could potentially change your life. Brock again told Michael that he and the boss were seriously impressed with Michael's work so far. Not just the fact that he kept silent about the motel incident, but also they knew Michael clearly had not looked inside of any of those packages. And so collectively, this proved that Michael was dependable and loyal. And so he told Michael that what he wanted to do was introduce Michael to the boss, because he thought maybe the boss would take a liking to Michael and move him up in the organization. Maybe give him a more managerial role like Brock's, where the role was more prestigious and had more responsibility, but critically came with higher pay. After hearing this, Michael felt both excited and nervous. He was excited because he wanted nothing more than to make the kind of money that Brock did. And after working with Brock now for several months, Michael had become kind of desensitized to violence and danger. He realized he could put his morals aside if it meant he would never have to be financially insecure ever again. But the thing that made Michael nervous was meeting the boss. I mean, he really didn't know much about who this guy was. All he knew is he was perfectly prepared to resort to violence if people wronged him. And so Michael knew how critical it was to stay on this guy's good side. But as all these conflicting thoughts were swirling around Michael's head, Brock said something else. He said before he would actually take Michael to meet the boss, Michael had to pass one more test. Michael would have to prove that he was capable of more than simply delivering packages and keeping secrets. Basically, he needed to prove that he could be as cutthroat and brutal as Brock was. After saying this, Brock just kind of leaned back and stared at Michael, studying his reaction. And at first, Michael really didn't even know what to say or do. He was like, okay, is Brock expecting me to come up with, some sort of way that I can demonstrate this? Do I need to come up with a test myself and do it? Or is Brock about to give me some assignment? Like, what's going on here? But then, before Brock could say anything else to clarify this whole situation, Michael had this epiphany. He suddenly realized that he already had the proof he needed to demonstrate to Brock and to the boss that he could basically handle anything they threw at him. Before meeting Brock, something truly awful and just totally messed up happened in Michael's life, and Michael had persevered his way through it. And so Michael was thinking to himself, if he just told the story of what happened to Brock and to the boss, they would be convinced that he was their guy. And so feeling very confident, Michael looked Brock right in the eye and he told him about his past. And as he told the story, Brock's eyes went wide. And by the end of the story, when Michael finally finished up, Brock just said, okay, yeah, you're ready to meet the boss. The meeting with the boss was scheduled for a few days later. And on that day, Michael showed up to this fancy hotel in a nearby city. And when he walked into the lobby, he saw Brock was sitting there waiting for him. When Brock saw Michael, he smiled and stood up, gestured for Michael to come over, and then the two of them walked upstairs to a particular hotel room. But when Brock unlocked the hotel room door and the two men went inside this lavish suite with this gorgeous living room and an amazing view, Michael looked around and realized it was empty. And he said to Brock, like, where's the boss? And Brock said, the boss doesn't wait for anyone. People wait for the boss. And so just sit down, he'll be here soon. And so Michael said okay, and he took a seat and tried to stay calm. But in reality, he was very nervous. I mean, all this cloak and dagger stuff was really putting him on edge. He also knew he had to impress the boss when he got here, because if he did, he would have like this new lease on life, this big promotion, he'd be getting paid so much money. But if he didn't, if he failed to impress the boss, not only would he potentially be out of a job and back to sort of poverty, but also he could be in real danger here. And so as Michael is sitting there showing all the signs that he's totally nervous, Brock, who was in the room just kind of standing there, looked over and could sense, his friend clearly is on edge. And so he said, "Hey, Michael, here we go. Why don't you just run me through your story one more time, like a dry run, before you meet the boss. Get yourself ready." And so Michael, who at this point was so anxious, he was happy to be doing anything other than just sitting there quietly, quickly agreed to the idea and went through his story one more time. And right as he finished his story, there was a knock on the door. And so Brock said, "Okay, he's here. Are you ready?" And Michael's like, "Yeah, I'm ready." And so Brock walked over to the door, took one more look at Michael, opened it up, and when Michael looked outside and saw who was out there, he knew immediately he had made a terrible mistake. It would turn out the last several months of Michael's life was one big lie. That sweepstakes that Michael had won that got him the tickets to the game in Calgary, that wasn't real. Somebody had set that up just so Michael could meet Brock. Those packages that Michael was delivering for Brock, they were not sensitive. It was just packages that contained flour, like cooking flour. And that woman that Michael watched Brock beat up at the motel, she was acting, and so was Brock. Nobody got hurt in that entire altercation, and the blood that Michael saw on her face, well, she had blood capsules hidden in her mouth that she popped to make it look like she actually got beat up. However, there was one thing that was absolutely true about the last few months of Michael's life, and that was that Brock really was involved in a secretive organization, and Brock really did want to bring Michael inside of it. It's just that the organization was not the criminal enterprise that Michael thought it was. Instead, it was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And Brock was an undercover officer running an elaborate sting designed entirely to get Michael to confess to his crimes, which he did while secret cameras inside of that hotel room recorded every single word he said. Michael's crime was murder. 2 years earlier, his girlfriend, Erin Chorney, had tried to break up with him, and he'd been so mad about it that he attacked her, wound up strangling her until she fell unconscious, and then he drowned her in the bathtub. And so this was the story he told Brock and intended to tell the boss to convince them that he was their guy, that he was tough and could do anything they wanted. He basically was telling them, "Hey guys, I'm literally a murderer." And so when they heard that knock on the door in the hotel room and Michael turned, expecting it to be the boss, well, instead, he saw a whole bunch of police officers coming into the hotel room to arrest him for that murder that he confessed to. Erin's body was ultimately recovered from the dump site where Michael had left her, and she was given a proper burial. As for Michael, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. On the morning of September 12, 2007, 20-year-old Ashley Wallace was in her dorm room at Bryant and Stratton College in Buffalo, New York, getting ready for her very first day of classes. And this was really exciting for her. I mean, she had just moved out on her own for the first time. It feels like she's an adult here. And so today was a big day. She looked herself in the mirror and made sure her look was just right. She gathered up all her books and her journals and all the stuff she would need. And then once she was ready, she began heading towards the door. But before she got there, she heard a knock on her door. And Ashley felt sort of confused, like she hadn't lived here long enough for people to actually know she lived here, so who would be coming to visit her? And she certainly didn't have any plans to see anybody today. And so she's thinking, like, I have no idea who could be at my door right now. So she walks to the door, she opens it up, and she is truly shocked now to see who's standing there. But her shock quickly turns into fear. So there were 2 police officers standing in the hallway looking right at Ashley, and the looks on their faces were very serious. Now, Ashley, the reason she felt so scared when she saw these police officers was not because she had, done something wrong. It was because in her life, before she got to college, she had experienced some pretty severe trauma. So her father had passed away when she was 13, a sudden heart attack, and it had been very traumatic for her. It sort of threw the family for a loop. And then her mother had remarried, and her stepfather, who had, raised her from that point on, he had sort of struggled with depression on and off, and it seemed like he was doing okay, but not long after her biological father had suddenly died, her stepfather took his own life. And so once again, Ashley and her family's lives were turned upside down. And so in many ways, Ashley had not really recovered from those two losses. Those happened not that long ago. And now she was out here on her own, trying to be an adult, trying her best to stay composed. But she just had this awful feeling when she saw these police officers that they were there to tell her that, somebody else close to her had died. But when the officers actually began speaking to Ashley, it was clear they were not here to notify her about, a new death, but they were here to talk about her family. They told her that they were there to speak to her about her father, her biological father, who had passed away 7 years earlier. And so when they said that to Ashley, she was like, okay, what do you mean? What do you want to know about my dad? And they told her that, Ashley, we exhumed your father. And it turns out he very likely did not die of a heart attack. We think he was murdered. About 30 minutes later, when these officers had finally left Ashley's room, Ashley was left feeling completely distraught. I mean, number one, she's just found out that there is suspicion that her father was killed by somebody, but worse than that was these two officers who had been here were not here to console Ashley. They were here to effectively interrogate her. They were looking into the family to see if, Ashley was involved in what happened to her father. And so for Ashley, this had really caught her off guard. She felt like she was stammering and confused in all of her answers, which only made her seem more suspicious. And it was like every little misstep she had, the police would dial in and ask even more pointed questions. And by the end of it, she was just sobbing and telling them, like, I didn't do this. I didn't hurt my dad. I have no idea who would do that. And so eventually the police had gotten up and left. But they told Ashley they were going to be in touch, and then they were gone. And so Ashley's just left there in her room, wondering what she's supposed to do now. She thought about, sucking it up and just going to class, but she's thinking, like, how can I possibly focus on class right now when I've just learned what I've learned and had this horrible experience with the police? And so Ashley ended up calling her mother, and her mother was obviously very upset when she picked up, even before Ashley said anything. And Ashley quickly learned that her mother also had a sort of similar experience with police that day, that she had also been told that, her husband apparently had been killed and they were now investigating her to see if maybe she had something to do with it. And so the two women just sort of cried on the phone and they began saying, like, I just don't understand, like, who would want to hurt him? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, they've got to be wrong. Like, none of this makes any sense. And so eventually Ashley's mother, whose name was Stacy, just told her daughter to come home, forget about classes, we can deal with that stuff later. Just come home, be with your family. Ashley agreed that was the most reasonable thing to do here. And so she grabbed her stuff, she left the dorm, hopped in her car, and she drove the hour back to her mom's place. And when she gets there and she goes inside, the first person she sees is actually her younger sister, Bree, who was 16 years old. And Bree's eyes were red. She obviously had been crying. And, in the first couple of seconds they spoke, it was clear that Bree, too, had had a sort of rough interaction with police as well that day. And so it's like the whole family has been thrust into this chaotic moment that none of them can make any sense of. On the one hand, it's like, who would want to hurt dad? But on the other, it's like, did this really happen? Is this a mistake? Like, why did they exhume his body in the first place? Like, what's going on here? There was just so much unknown. And so that afternoon, Ashley, her sister Bree, and their mom just retreated to their mother's kitchen. And there they mostly cried together and just sort of talked through this horrible situation. But eventually, later in the day, when the tears had sort of stopped flowing and reality had set in, that this was now a very complicated situation, if nothing else. I mean, basically, they were all under investigation for the potential murder of their father/husband, and they sort of didn't know what was going to happen next. But there was a lot of stress around, the next couple of days. They didn't know. And so under all this stress, Stacy, the mom, was like, you know what? I'm getting a drink. Do any of you guys want a drink? And Bree was only 16 and she declined. But Ashley said, sure. She was 20, not 21 yet, but she was drinking at this point, and so she said, yep, I'll take a drink. And so Stacy mixed some drinks for her and Ashley, as well as a non-alcoholic drink for Bree. And so for the rest of the night, the girls just sat in the kitchen having their drinks and trying hard not to let this horrible situation totally wreck them. The next morning, when Ashley woke up inside of her mother's house, she found she was really hungover. Now, she obviously had had some drinks the night before with her mom and her sister, but she was thinking to herself, like, the level of hungover she was feeling felt disproportionate. Like, she was really hungover despite a relatively small amount of alcohol. But Ashley was wondering if maybe part of the reason she felt so bad was not just a hangover. Maybe it was like this emotional fallout from this horrible thing that happened the day before. And so Ashley, she's laying in bed feeling so bad, and she's just convincing herself that I just need to get up, I need to go to my classes, I need to sort of treat the day like a normal day and sort of get my life back together and be ready to potentially deal with police or, whatever else is going to happen here. And so Ashley sort of wills herself out of bed. She's got a blinding headache. She feels horrible, but nonetheless, she takes a shower, she gets herself together, and before long, she's saying bye to her mom and sister, and she's driving back to the campus. And when she gets there, she still feels terrible, but, she goes to her classes, and she does her best to focus, which really turned out to be a gargantuan task, but she did it. And then finally, at the end of the day, during her last class, Ashley began to sort of break out of this fog, this hangover fog that she was in, and she began sort of feeling normal again. And so by the time she left the lecture hall and was done for the day, she actually felt good enough that she hopped right back in her car and drove right back to her mother's house. And that night, again, just like the night before, she, her sister, and her mom just sat in the kitchen, just sort of having this cathartic moment together, crying together, talking about their dad, sharing memories, sharing theories, and also having a few drinks. And again, Bree did not have any alcohol, but Ashley and her mother did. The next morning, when Ashley woke up, once again, her head was pounding. She was so hungover, way worse than the day before. Except when she opened her eyes and kind of looked around, that really was not the first thing that hit her. The first thing that hit her is, I don't know where I am. The room looked different. And as she kind of adjusted and looked around, she realized she was in a hospital room. And so Ashley began to panic and began looking around for her family or anybody she recognized, but nobody that she knew was in there. There were just these two police officers sitting against the wall in her room. And these two officers, when they saw Ashley coming to, they got up and they walked over to her and they explained to her that she was very lucky that her mother had actually found her in her bed at her mother's house that morning, and Ashley had been unresponsive. And so her mother had called an ambulance and they had rushed her here, and luckily she was stabilized now, but apparently she was very close to full-blown organ failure. Like, she almost died. It was very lucky she got here when she did. But before Ashley could ask any questions, well, what was it that was causing my body to shut down? Like, what's going on here? These two police officers kind of looked at each other, and then one of them pulled a piece of paper out of their pocket and they handed it to Ashley. And they said, you need to explain yourself. It would turn out the way Ashley's stepfather had taken his own life was by drinking antifreeze. At least that was the initial theory. But pretty quickly, investigators started to say, why would somebody take their own life that way? Drinking antifreeze is slow and painful. That's not a good first choice if you're gonna take your own life. And so as suspicions rose around the stepfather, investigators thought, okay, well, the biological father died just a few years before, and apparently he died of a heart attack, but maybe we ought to make sure, because we're basically suggesting that maybe somebody did this to the stepfather. Is it possible somebody, killed the biological father? And so they exhumed the biological father, and during the autopsy, they discovered antifreeze in his remains. And so now, fast forward to the hospital where Ashley has woken up. These officers have walked over to her, they've handed her a note and told her to explain herself. And this note was effectively a confession. The writer of this note said they killed Ashley's biological father, and then they also killed Ashley's stepfather. But now, because of the blood on their hands, they're going to take their own lives. So this was a suicide note / confession. And at the bottom of this note, it was signed by Ashley. Except Ashley did not kill her father or stepfather. Her mother did. Her mother used antifreeze to poison and kill both men, and then when police began poking around saying, what's going on here? We think somebody killed this guy and maybe him too. Well, what did Ashley's beloved mother do? She tried to poison her own daughter. She laced those alcoholic drinks they were having in her kitchen with all these painkillers to make it look like Ashley had taken her own life because she felt so guilty about murdering these two men. Except Ashley's mother called the ambulance a little bit too early the following day, feigning that she had just found her daughter unresponsive, because the ambulance, they showed up and first responders, they saved Ashley's life. Narrowly. Apparently, she was within 15 minutes of dying when she showed up at the hospital. Stacy was convicted of 2 murders, as well as the attempted murder of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison. However, she would die behind bars in 2016. Lunchtime on March 31st, 2010, a man in his mid-50s named John Schmeier was sitting at a table with a bunch of his friends inside of a Hooters restaurant in the small city of York, Pennsylvania. So John was a retired eye doctor. He'd had a very successful career, made a bunch of money, and his friends that were at this table with him were also, pretty successful guys, sort of like mid to upper tier professionals with very successful careers too. But what they were doing today had nothing to do with career. This was pure pleasure. This group of guys, this specific group of friends who were very, very close, they would meet up, a couple times a month at this particular Hooters. They would sit at the same table, they would order the same things. They loved it. It was sort of like their little clubhouse. And in fact, they had even come up with a name for, this group of friends. They called themselves the Orange Shorts Society. And so the reason they did that is because Hooters has a sort of vibe to it that if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't been there, basically the waitresses dress in very scantily clad clothing, and they all wear these sort of iconic white tank tops and orange shorts. And so basically these men were sort of joking that they were the Orange Short Society because of the shorts these women would all wear. And so that afternoon, John and the rest of the members of the Orange Short Society all sat around chatting and, BSing with each other, just being guys. And at some point, John brought up a subject that the rest of the society was accustomed to him bringing up, and that was his ex-wife, Monica. So all of his friends knew that John had been married to Monica for 20 years, but then they got divorced in 2003, so 7 years earlier. But still, Monica was a thorn in John's side because he had to pay her alimony. And, he understood that that comes with the territory of divorce. It is what it is. But Monica had made the way John paid her the alimony really cumbersome. And John was convinced, as he would tell his buddies in the Orange Short Society, that it was totally intentional, that she had made it cumbersome. She wanted it to be hard. She didn't like John, and she was punishing him. And so what Monica did is she made John literally each week take cash out of an ATM, put it in an envelope, and then physically drive it to her house and drop it off. She would not accept payment any other way. And the reason she was able to do that is because she claimed she did not have a bank account, and she couldn't be forced to make a bank account. And so either John made these cumbersome payments in cash, or he risked not making the payment at all, and then she could come after him legally. And so he was sort of trapped, making this trek once a week to hand over cash to his ex-wife, who he really couldn't stand. Now, their divorce was not super contentious. The two of them just sort of drifted apart. They stopped seeing eye to eye. And actually, Monica really didn't like the whole Orange Short Society thing. She thought it was totally scummy and that John and his buddies were just kind of gross for going to that restaurant and sort of making jokes about, what these women are wearing and making that part of their identity, the Orange Short Society. She didn't like it. And so they just kind of drifted apart. That was all it was. But now it had become this sort of bitter feud between the two of them. And so at the same time that John and his buddies in the Orange Short Society are sitting in the restaurant and John is going on his tirade once again about Monica's alimony, simultaneously on the other side of town, police rushed to Monica's house. Minutes earlier, there had been a 911 call that came from Monica's house, but when the operator answered, there was no answer. And so by protocol, they had just sent first responders out to the house to see if whoever had called was okay. And so the police, they get to Monica's house, they park, they go right up to the front door, they're knocking on the door, there's no answer, they're looking around, there's no sign of forced entry, no sign of anything really going on here, it's just a quiet day in the neighborhood. But they go to the door again, they knock a few more times, and when there's no answer, they try the doorknob, and it's unlocked. So they open the door up, and right away, they look in, and there's Monica. And she's dead on the ground with the phone right next to her, and she's been shot in the head. Shortly after this discovery, the lead detective, Douglas Demagon, along with his team, began to survey the crime scene. And they quickly found a purse next to Monica's body, and inside was her license. That was how they identified her. And then they also found a .32 caliber shell casing lying near the body that clearly seemed to be from the round that struck her in the head and killed her. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of this crime scene had really nothing to do with the body. It was all the money that they found all over the house, specifically cash in envelopes. There were these envelopes in trash cans and drawers, on tables. I mean, it was kind of like all over the place, some out in the open, some hidden. But there was lots of money stashed in this home. And so Demagon and the other investigators began to wonder if, okay, maybe this was a robbery and Monica got killed in the process. But it's like, okay, if it was a robbery, why is there so much cash out in the open, literally packaged up in envelopes, easy to, remove from the house? Why is it all here? It's almost like no cash was taken, or certainly not very much was taken, and also other valuables are still in place. It didn't have the feel of somebody ransacking the house. It just sort of felt like somebody came in here and killed Monica. Detective Demagon and his team searched the whole house, and they couldn't find any sign of forced entry. So basically, whoever came in here and did this either, just walked in because a door or window was unlocked, or maybe Monica let them in, maybe she knew who they were, or they had a key. Detective Demagon asked the forensics team to begin sweeping the house for DNA to see if maybe they could find something that could show them who had been here lately. And so while that team got started, Demagon continued to walk around the house, and he eventually found a Rolodex, which is basically like a big book full of phone numbers and addresses. And as the detective was flipping through that book, that was how he discovered that Monica had an ex-husband, John Schmeier. That evening, Detective Demagon and another investigator rolled up to John Schmeier's house. They walked up to the front door and they knocked, and then a moment later, the door opened, and John was standing there looking very surprised. So in homicide cases, generally speaking, the spouse or ex-spouse is always suspect number one. And so even though Demagon didn't really have any evidence linking John to the crime, he did have the fact that this was her ex-spouse, and so therefore, he is suspicious. Before John could ask any questions, Demagon and his partner introduced themselves and said they'd like to come in and speak to John. So John said, okay, come on in. So they walked inside, they sat down, and then once they were seated, Detective Demagon watched John very closely as he told him why they were there. Basically, your ex-wife has been murdered, and we're here to talk to you about it. Detective Demagon wanted to see if John would have a big reaction or maybe a subdued reaction. Whatever reaction he might have could be telling to how involved he maybe was or wasn't in this case. When Demagon told John that Monica had been shot to death, John's reaction was huge. His eyes went wide, he clutched at his chest like he was having a heart attack, and then he kind of leaned forward and began sobbing. But when he came back up again, the detective noticed there were no tears in John's eyes. It was just this sort of huge reaction, but Demagon couldn't really tell if it was genuine or not. He also didn't have a baseline for John. He didn't know if this was normal, but this seemed really dramatic, almost like he might be acting. So instead of trying to console John, Demagon just asked point blank, where were you earlier this afternoon at the time of the shooting? And when he asked this, John, who still was sort of rocking back and forth and grabbing his chest and acting very upset, he suddenly stopped, put his hands by his side, and just said, oh, I was at Hooters with my friends. A few days later, Detective Demagon went to the Hooters, where John and his friends would always meet up, and he asked the manager to see the security footage from the previous Wednesday, the day of the shooting. So by this point, Demagon had actually already interviewed all of the friends who had been at the Hooters with John, the so-called Orange Shorts Society, and he had asked them all about John. Like, had he really been there? What was he doing? What was he saying? And they all said John absolutely was there the whole time. Like, there's no way he could have left and done anything to Monica. He was here with us. I promise you he was here. Now, they would admit to the detective that, John did speak disparagingly about Monica. He would talk about how mad he was about her alimony, and he definitely didn't like her very much. But that was it. That was the extent of his hatred. Now, despite how convincingly these friends said John was there the whole time, he couldn't have done this, Demagon still needed proof. He needed to really see that John had been here when he said he was here. So John went to the manager, they pulled up the security footage from the previous Wednesday, and wouldn't you know it, there's John, he comes in, he sits down, he's with his buddies, and he is there the whole time, during the time that Monica was killed. And so at this point, Demagon did feel like it sort of was impossible that John actually went and killed Monica, but given the contention between them, John apparently really doesn't like Monica, he hates making these payments to her, like there's obvious friction that comes up at these Orange Short Society meetings all the time. Maybe it was possible that John, who was pretty well off, had a bunch of money, maybe he hired somebody to do his dirty work for him. Maybe he hired a hitman. And so over the next week or so, Demagon and his team began exploring this hitman lead, and they found that John had been taking out a whole bunch of cash over the last several weeks. But it sort of lined up with how much cash he owed Monica in the form of alimony, and they knew he had to, per Monica's orders, deliver this alimony payment in cash to her in these envelopes, and they found all those envelopes of cash at Monica's house, and so it seemed like that was all he was doing, taking money out to give to Monica. And so John was basically Demagon's only suspect at this point, and there was basically no evidence against him. And so Demagon knew he really needed to look into other leads here, like the John lead kind of going nowhere. And so he and his team began looking into local gang activity and, crimes in the area. Could this have just been random or something completely unrelated? But after 3 months of looking for any connection anywhere in the area, there wasn't one, and the case kind of came to a stall. And so at this point, Demagon decided that the only thing he could do realistically was just kind of start over, go back to square one, and basically re-examine all the evidence all over again. And that included going back and looking at the security footage from the Hooters on that Wednesday when the Orange Short Society was there. And so Demagon, he sat down, he starts watching this tape over and over and over again. It's like the 1,000th time he's looked at this grainy footage, and suddenly something stands out to him. Something he missed all the other times he looked. And as he replayed the footage over and over again, he realized he now knew almost certainly what happened to Monica. It would turn out the footage of the Orange Short Society meeting did hold the secret to Monica's murder. John Schmeier did not kill his ex-wife, nor did he hire a hitman to do it. He really had nothing to do with her death. The only thing he did do is, at these Orange Short Society meetups, he would talk openly about how he didn't really like Monica. In particular, he resented the fact that she was making him deliver all this cash to her to pay his alimony payments. It just felt totally cumbersome. But that meant John, on a regular basis, was telling these men in the Orange Short Society that Monica was flush with cash. He was giving her tons of cash every single week. This woman has so much cash at her house. And eventually, one of the Orange Short Society members, a man named Tim Jacoby, decided, you know what? I'm going to go to Monica's house and I'm going to take that cash. Demagon had been operating under the assumption that all the men who were present on that Wednesday meetup at Hooters, the Orange Short Society, that was the totality of the group. Those were all the members. Because the way the men talked about their group was they all meet up every single time. Same group, same seats, same restaurant. And so Demagon assumed, okay, then it's the same people. This is it. This is the totality of the group. Everybody is accounted for. But no. On the day of the murder, one regular member of the Orange Short Society was not present. Tim Jacoby. And that is the discrepancy that Demagon caught when he watched that footage for the 1,000th time. He realized, wait a minute, there's another guy. I heard another guy's name, Tim Jacoby. He's not here. Police would later tie Tim to the crime scene with DNA evidence. They determined that Tim went to her house with the intention of robbing her, but when Monica fought back, he shot and killed her and then fled without taking any money. Tim was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Pennsylvania.